He traveled across America, blending into neighborhoods, shops, and gas stations, always unnoticed. But behind that calm, ordinary facade lurked one of the most calculated and terrifying killers in modern history. Israel Keyes wasn't just a serial killer. He was a nomadic predator who planned his crimes with military precision, left no pattern, and struck completely at random. From pre-buried kill kits to patient surveillance, every step of his murderous path was executed with chilling logic. Tonight, we unravel the secrets of his mind, the methods that allowed him to vanish into the shadows, and the horrifying legacy he left behind. Stay tuned, because the story of Israel Keyes will make you question everything you thought you knew about danger hiding in plain sight. If you'd like more stories like this to appear on your page, please like, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe. There are 15 chapters in this series, each with one picture looping gently. Just close your eyes, relax, and let's dive into the story together. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Shadow in Plain Sight. The making of a predator in the quiet corners of America, where wilderness meets small-town life. Few could have imagined that one of the most elusive and methodical serial killers of modern times was moving among them. Unnoticed, unremarkable, and almost invisible. His name was Israel Keyes, a man whose calm demeanor and ordinary life masked a mind shaped by obsession, precision, and darkness. Between the late 1990s and 2012, he would become one of the most chilling examples of a new kind of murderer, a nomadic predator who killed not for passion or revenge, but for the cold perfection of control. Keyes was not the kind of killer who left behind patterns that police could easily trace. There were no familiar hunting grounds, no typical victim types, and no consistent methods. He could fly from Alaska to New York, rent a car, drive hundreds of miles into a random small town, dig up a hidden cache of weapons and tools he had buried years earlier, and strike, then vanish back into the ordinary rhythm of life. It was a level of patience and calculation that baffled even seasoned FBI profilers. When Israel Keyes' name first appeared in headlines in 2012, the world knew little about him. There was only the shocking story of an Alaskan barista who vanished in the cold of night, and the man accused of her murder. But behind that single crime was a far greater, darker story, one that would emerge piece by piece as investigators realized they had uncovered a killer unlike any they had encountered before. Keyes had constructed a life designed to hide him in plain sight. He was a father, a business owner, a veteran, and a man who often went unnoticed in crowds. To his neighbors, he was quiet, reliable, and even polite. Yet behind that exterior was a person who studied violence like a discipline. He admired the meticulousness of serial killers like Ted Bundy, but what set him apart was his desire not to be recognized at all. He despised those who sought fame. Keyes wanted to be the ghost that no one ever caught. A killer who would leave behind no story. Born in 1978, Israel Keyes grew up in a world far removed from the cities and suburbs most Americans knew. His childhood in rural Washington state was steeped in isolation, survivalism, and strict religious control. He was raised without modern comforts, surrounded by vast forests and silence. That isolation nurtured in him a fascination with self-reliance, and perhaps an early seed of emotional detachment. From a young age, he learned to hunt animals and to disappear into the woods for hours, traits that would later become essential to his crimes. But Keyes' transformation from a quiet boy in the woods to a man capable of methodical killing didn't happen overnight. It was shaped by years of internalized anger, experimentation, and curiosity about power and death. He began to test boundaries, first with small acts of cruelty toward animals, and later with the thrill of burglary, and arson. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already decided that he would one day kill a human being. What made him dangerous was not just that desire, but the discipline with which he prepared for the military. Keyes learned the structure and control that would later define his approach to murder. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in the late 1990s and was stationed at various bases, including Fort Lewis in Washington and Fort Hood in Texas. Fellow soldiers described him as intelligent, quiet, and methodical, never drawing attention to himself. He drank with friends, listened to heavy metal music, and seemed ordinary. But internally, he was refining a philosophy, one that merged violence, secrecy, and domination into a personal code. Keyes would later tell investigators that he separated his life into compartments. In one, he was the father who loved his daughter and ran a small construction business in Anchorage. In another, he was the traveler, the explorer, and in the darkest, most secret compartment, he was the killer. He prided himself on maintaining those divisions so cleanly that no one would ever suspect a thing. The defining feature of Keyes' crimes was his preparation. Long before committing a murder, he would travel across states and bury kill kits, buckets filled with weapons, cash, zip ties, and tools, hidden deep in remote locations. These caches allowed him to strike spontaneously, yet with complete readiness. Years later, he could return to one of those sites, retrieve his buried kit, and execute a crime with chilling precision. It was this patience, this long-game strategy, that made him so unlike other killers of his time. He didn't rely on impulsive emotions or opportunity alone. Every detail was thought out. He chose victims randomly to avoid patterns, traveled across the country to create confusion, and selected locations far from his home. The randomness was part of his design, a way to ensure that no investigator could ever connect the dots. To him, control wasn't just in the act of killing. It was in the way he shaped his invisibility. Yet beneath that meticulous calm was something more haunting, an emptiness that seemed to drive him forward. Those who later analyzed Keyes' behavior saw not just intelligence, but detachment of a terrifying kind. He didn't kill out of rage or hatred. He killed because he wanted to, and because it made him feel alive. The lack of emotional motive made him both unpredictable and impossible to profile. When he was finally caught, it wasn't the result of years of investigation or a pattern finally recognized. It was a mistake, a rare slip in his otherwise perfect design. And it began not in the dense forests of Washington or the desolate highways of Texas, but in Anchorage, Alaska, on a cold February night in 2012. A young woman named Samantha Koenig went missing from a coffee stand, and her disappearance would unravel the hidden world of a man who had managed to kill across the United States without leaving a trace. But before that night, before the panic, the headlines, and the confession tapes, Israel Keyes had already been living a double life for more than a decade. He had refined his methods, studied human behavior, and learned how to vanish into the background of ordinary America. He was, in many ways, the perfect predator, one who could walk beside you in line at a grocery store, share a polite smile, and still carry in his mind the memory of his last kill. AS investigators would later discover the story of Israel Keyes was not just about the murders themselves, but about the philosophy behind them, a cold, calculated approach to evil that redefined what modern serial killing could look like. And though his crimes would come to light only after his arrest, the seeds of that darkness had been sown long before. In the isolation of childhood, the discipline of the military, and the restless mind of a man who wanted complete control over life and death. When Israel Keyes finally became a name in the world of criminal investigation, the revelation stunned those who had known him personally. They had seen a quiet craftsman who built decks, repaired roofs, and picked up his daughter from school with an ordinary father's ease. To them, Keyes was reserved, perhaps a little distant, but never alarming. No one imagined that behind that calm exterior was a man who spent nights studying crime scenes, mapping routes, and researching how to outsmart police technology. In the years leading up to his first confirmed murder, Keyes had lived what seemed like a normal life. He was self-employed, running his small construction company, Keyes Construction, in Anchorage, Alaska. He was well-spoken, punctual, and rarely emotional. His clients often described him as professional and dependable. Yet while he installed windows and built fences, his mind was somewhere else. Crafting the perfect plan for the next time he would kill, he had a deep appreciation for logistics, the art of planning, movement, and concealment. His travels across the United States weren't random, they were rehearsals. He studied airports, highways, and backroads. He memorized how long it took to drive from one small town to another without attracting attention. He learned how to disable security cameras and how to make himself forgettable. Each trip became part of his private experiment in anonymity. Those who met Keyes in his day-to-day life never suspected that he was deliberately shaping himself to be ordinary. He didn't draw attention with tattoos, wild stories, or erratic behavior. Instead, he blended in so completely that even when he was pulled over by police or interacted with strangers, no one remembered him afterward. This skill, of becoming invisible in plain sight, was his greatest weapon. Keyes' fascination with control extended beyond the act of killing. He wanted to master every aspect of his existence. He believed in absolute independence, no reliance on society, no moral authority above himself. His interest in survivalism and his childhood training in living off the land made him uniquely capable of disappearing at will. He carried cash, avoided digital traces, and used rental cars and obscure motels. To investigators, it was as if his life existed just beyond the reach of modern tracking systems. That he was, in many ways, a new archetype, the modern nomadic killer, one who understood how to use the systems of travel and technology to vanish across vast distances. In an age of surveillance, where cameras watched nearly every corner of public life, Keyes remained invisible. He could book a flight under his own name, commit a murder 1,000 miles away, and return home in time to attend his daughter's school event. The frightening part wasn't just what he did, it was how easily he did it. He understood the psychology of both his victims and the people hunting him. He knew that police often looked for personal connections between killer and victim, so he made sure there were none. He knew that investigators searched for geographic patterns, so he moved constantly. And he knew that time eroded evidence, so he buried his tools years in advance, ensuring nothing could link him to the scene. When the FBI finally sat down with Keyes after his capture, they were struck by how calmly he discussed his crimes. There was no boastfulness, no remorse, no emotion at all. He spoke as if describing the steps of a job he had completed with professional precision. He referred to his victims as projects. The killings were not acts of passion but of purpose, an exercise in discipline and domination. But the seeds of this control lay deep in his upbringing. The Keyes family had lived off-grid for most of Israel's childhood, isolated from society and steeped in extremist religious views. The children were homeschooled, forbidden from watching television or interacting with outsiders. Israel spent long hours alone in the woods, learning how to trap animals and handle weapons. This early exposure to death, and the lack of emotional guidance surrounding it, shaped his perception of life's fragility. It dulled the natural empathy most children develop. As he grew older, that isolation began to manifest as rebellion. He rejected religion and authority, moving toward a philosophy of self-rule. He saw himself as the ultimate arbiter of morality, beholden to no one. In his mind, killing wasn't evil if he decided it wasn't. He crafted his own moral universe, where power equaled purpose. By the time he left the military and began traveling the country, he had already decided that he would live by this code until the end. That KEYES' early criminal acts were experiments. He committed burglaries and arsons, often for no material gain. He wanted the thrill of invading someone's space, of proving he could do it without being caught. These smaller acts were test runs for something larger, the ultimate form of control. When he finally committed his first murder, it wasn't impulsive. It was, in his mind, the logical next step in perfecting his craft. What makes KEYES' story so unnerving is not just the number of his crimes. Though investigators believe there may have been more than 10 murders across the United States, but how completely he managed to separate his two worlds. His girlfriend and daughter lived with him in Alaska, unaware of the hidden caches of weapons he buried beneath frozen ground. His friends saw him as a calm, easygoing man. No one saw the darkness, because he had built his life around making sure no one could. The FBI would later describe KEYES as one of the most methodical serial killers in American history. He didn't kill out of compulsion. He killed because he wanted to perfect the process. He studied other killers not to imitate them, but to avoid their mistakes. He despised those who sought attention or left patterns. In one of his interviews, he even mocked Ted Bundy, saying that Bundy was sloppy. To KEYES, true mastery meant never being caught, and the only mistake, in his mind, was failure. That failure came in 2012, and even then, it was by chance. A small oversight, a moment of overconfidence, would pull back the curtain on years of hidden violence. The arrest that would follow seemed almost anticlimactic at first. No one, not even the arresting officers, realized that the quiet man in custody was about to confess to murders scattered across the country. Before his capture, KEYES had lived the life of a phantom, one who moved through airports, highways, and neighborhoods like a shadow. He left no signature, no taunt, no pattern. He simply existed within the gaps of the system. For over a decade, he had done what few modern killers could. He had turned anonymity into an art form. And when his mask finally cracked, the story that emerged would haunt not only the investigators who heard it, but an entire nation that realized such a man had walked among them, unnoticed, unremarked upon, and unseen. Israel KEYES was not the monster hiding in the dark alley. He was the neighbor across the street, the contractor fixing your window, the man you passed at the airport gate. And that realization, that true evil could be so perfectly ordinary, would forever redefine the meaning of a modern predator. Chapter 2: Roots of Darkness. Childhood in Isolation. Long before Israel KEYES became a name whispered in fear and fascination, he was simply a boy growing up in the deep wilderness, a child whose world was defined by silence, isolation, and an ideology that would shape the contours of his mind in disturbing ways. His story began far from cities and highways, in the rugged forests of rural Utah and Washington state, where his parents sought to live a life untouched by modern society. Born in Richmond, Utah, in 1978, Israel KEYES was the second of 10 children in a family that rejected the outside world almost entirely. His parents, John and Heidi, were devout fundamentalists, drawn to a brand of Christianity that viewed the government, modern education, and secular culture as corrupt. They were determined to raise their children according to what they believed were divine principles, rules set by God, not by man. To achieve that, they moved deep into isolation, far away from neighbors, schools, and the influences of mainstream America. The KEYES family built their first home themselves, a small cabin without electricity or running water in the woods near Colville, Washington. The children chopped wood, hauled water from streams, and grew vegetables. They lived by candlelight and prayer, their lives revolving around survival and scripture. For young Israel, the forest became both playground and teacher. He learned how to shoot, track animals, and navigate the wilderness before he could fully understand what those skills would later mean. In that quiet expanse of green and shadow, something inside him began to take shape, a self-reliance so extreme it bordered on emotional detachment. There were no neighborhood friends, no schoolmates, and little sense of community. What existed instead was a rigid world where obedience and silence were expected, and questioning authority was seen as rebellion. The boundaries between morality, fear, and power were unclear. Neighbors who later came to know the KEYES family remembered them as distant and secretive. They were not part of the local social fabric. The children rarely interacted with others and were often seen working in the yard or accompanying their parents to religious meetings. Israel's father was strict and authoritarian, teaching his children that the world was full of sin and deception. The isolation that was meant to protect them from corruption instead became a cocoon that stifled emotional development. From an early age, Israel displayed signs of unusual detachment. He seemed withdrawn, even among his siblings. He was curious, intelligent, and quiet, always watching, always calculating. While other children might seek approval or companionship, Israel appeared content in solitude. He enjoyed being alone in the woods, testing his limits, building traps, and practicing archery. His fascination with control and mastery began there, in the endless stillness of the forest where he could dictate every movement, every outcome. It was also in those woods that Israel began to test the darker edges of curiosity. He later admitted to harming animals in his youth, small acts of cruelty that escalated over time. At first, it might have seemed like mischief or an attempt to exert control over something weaker than himself. But as the years went by, those acts became colder, more deliberate. He hunted not for food but for power, for the feeling of being the one who decided when a life ended. In the KEYES household, emotions were not discussed. Fear, sadness, or anger were things to be prayed away, not explored. There was no outlet for confusion or rebellion. Instead, Israel internalized everything, learning to keep his thoughts hidden. His inner world grew dense and private, a place no one else could enter. Over time, that secrecy became second nature, a shield he would carry into adulthood. Religion played a dominant role in the family's life, and its influence was suffocating. The KEYES children were taught strict biblical obedience, often attending churches affiliated with white supremacist or extremist movements. Among them were groups with ties to the Christian identity ideology, a belief system that fused radical religion with racial separatism. While not all the details of the family's involvement are clear, these early exposures to extremist thought shaped Israel's understanding of authority and morality. In his mind, the world was divided between the chosen and the damned, a hierarchy of worth and power that he would later interpret in his own twisted way. When the family moved to Maupin, Oregon, and later to Colville, Washington, Israel's isolation deepened. He was homeschooled, which meant his education came almost entirely from his parents' worldview. He learned practical survival skills, but little about social interaction or emotional intelligence. When he did encounter other children, his differences stood out. He was quieter, more intense, and sometimes cruel. The few people who remembered him from his youth described him as odd, unpredictable, or quietly angry. By his teenage years, Israel had begun to reject the rigid faith of his upbringing. He secretly stopped believing in God, seeing religion as hypocrisy and weakness. He once told investigators that he became an atheist around age 14 or 15, but chose to keep that secret from his family. Outwardly, he played the role of a dutiful son. Inwardly, he was constructing his own philosophy of life, one that placed himself at the center of all moral decision-making. This inner rebellion gave him a sense of power he had never known. In a life so tightly controlled by others, his private rejection of God became his first true act of defiance. It was also the beginning of his belief that he could define right and wrong on his own terms, a belief that would later underpin his crimes. Without faith, without empathy, and without a community to ground him, Israel Keyes began to drift toward darkness. He immersed himself in violent fantasies, imagining acts of control and domination. He practiced silence as a form of strength, learning how to hide his emotions so completely that no one could ever read him. It was not the outburst of rage that defined him. It was the stillness, the quiet, the ability to watch, plan, and wait that he once told investigators that he knew he was different long before he committed his first crime. He didn't feel guilt. He didn't feel empathy. He only felt curiosity, a desire to see what would happen if he pushed the boundaries further in his isolated world. He learned how to hunt, how to hide, and how to survive. But he also learned how to detach from the things that make people human: empathy, connection, and remorse. By the time he reached adulthood, Israel Keyes wasn't just capable of living without society. He preferred it. Solitude was his comfort. Control was his addiction. In the cold wilderness where he was raised, he had become something else entirely. Not the wild, chaotic figure of fiction, but something far more dangerous. A predator shaped by silence, discipline, and purpose. As the 1980s faded into the early 1990s, Israel Keyes' isolated world began to expand in small but significant ways. The boy who had grown up surrounded by pine trees and silence started venturing into nearby towns, observing people, learning how they behaved, and slowly realizing how different he truly was from them. While most teenagers sought connection, Israel sought control over himself, over his surroundings, and eventually, over others. His family's off-grid existence continued to dominate much of his youth. The Keyes home was a place where obedience was absolute, and questioning authority was nearly unthinkable. Israel's father was known to be strict, even harsh, while his mother reinforced the family's deep religious identity. Every aspect of their life was wrapped in the language of sin and salvation. But for Israel, that rigid environment didn't nurture faith. It fueled resistance. He began secretly mocking religion, even as he continued to attend church with his family. While his parents aligned themselves with fundamentalist congregations, including one connected to the Ark, a church with white separatist leanings, Israel's mind was turning towards something far removed from spirituality. He didn't just stop believing in God. He began to view himself as the ultimate authority over his own morality. The transformation was subtle at first. Israel became quieter, more withdrawn. He stopped engaging with his siblings and spent more time alone in the forest. Those around him mistook his solitude for shyness. In truth, it was something darker. He was building a secret world within himself, a place where no rule or moral law applied except his OW. And in those years, Keyes began to experiment with what he would later describe as thresholds. He wanted to test how far he could go without consequence, how much he could do, how close he could come to violence, without anyone knowing. His first acts of cruelty were directed at animals, particularly cats, and he later admitted to killing them in disturbing ways. He felt no guilt. Instead, he experienced something new, an intoxicating sense of control and power. Most serial offenders who begin with animal cruelty are driven by rage, confusion, or mimicry. Keyes was different. His actions were deliberate, methodical, and emotionless. He was studying his own capacity for violence. He wanted to know how it felt and whether he could hide it. When no one noticed, and when the guilt never came, he knew he had crossed a line most people could never imagine at the same time. His practical skills in hunting and tracking continued to sharpen. He learned how to move through the forest silently, how to stalk without being seen, and how to create traps that blended seamlessly into the environment. He was fascinated by the mechanics of life and death, how to take something apart, how to end it cleanly, and how to make it disappear. These abilities, developed in childhood, would later form the foundation for his precision as a killer by his mid-teens. Keyes had begun to form a distinct identity. He saw himself as superior to those around him, emotionally detached, intellectually aware, and free from the illusions of religion or morality. He often felt contempt for people who followed rules or showed vulnerability. To him, emotions were weaknesses to be exploited. He didn't seek friendships. He studied people like puzzles, learning how to mimic normalcy just enough to blend in. It was during this period that the first whispers of something deeply unsettling began to surface. A local family once reported that a teenage boy, widely believed to be Keyes, had broken into their home and stolen a gun. In another account, he was said to have tied a friend to a tree during a game and threatened him with a weapon, stopping only when the boy began to cry. While these incidents never led to formal charges, they hinted at the emergence of a dangerous confidence. Israel was testing not only his boundaries, but also his ability to dominate others. The Keyes family eventually moved to Smyrna, Maine, where Israel spent some of his later teenage years. The relocation offered him new surroundings, but little change in his internal world. The family's isolation continued, though Israel began working odd jobs and interacting more with outsiders. He still avoided forming connections. Instead, he watched, observing human behavior with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying an experiment. Those who encountered him in Maine often described him as polite but emotionless. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words carried a quiet confidence. He could be charming when he wanted to be, but the charm was thin, mechanical, like someone performing a script he had memorized. He had learned how to wear masks, how to fit into situations without ever revealing what he really was to be. By the time he reached adulthood, the emotional void inside him had become complete. There were no traces of remorse, no pangs of conscience, no empathy for others. What existed instead was a cold, calculated curiosity, a desire to explore his own power and control over life itself. He later told investigators that around age 16, he realized he wanted to kill someone. It wasn't out of anger. It was out of fascination. He wanted to experience what it would feel like. The act itself, the control, and the aftermath. It was around this same time that Keyes began to embrace a self-image rooted in secrecy and independence. He viewed society as weak, controlled by illusion. To him, the only way to be free was to live without attachment, no emotional bonds, no moral constraints. This philosophy, shaped in the shadows of his isolated childhood, became the blueprint for the rest of his life. While many serial killers emerge from chaotic or abusive homes, Keyes' upbringing was different. It wasn't chaos that shaped him, it was order. The rigid, uncompromising structure of his childhood taught him discipline and patience. These traits, when combined with his lack of empathy, made him uniquely dangerous. He didn't act impulsively. He waited. He planned. He calculated. When he finally left home in the mid-1990s, he carried with him not just survival skills and practical knowledge, but a worldview that set him apart from humanity itself. He no longer saw people as individuals with feelings and lives of their own. To him, they were objects, moving pieces in a world he could manipulate. In later interviews, Keyes reflected on his childhood with an eerie detachment. He spoke of it not as a time of pain or trauma, but as a formative environment that taught him strength. He claimed he never saw himself as a victim, only as someone who learned early how to dominate his surroundings. When asked about his parents, he was respectful but unemotional. He acknowledged their strictness, their faith, and their isolation, but he spoke of them as if describing strangers. There was no warmth, no nostalgia, only analysis. That coldness, that absence of connection, was perhaps the most defining element of Israel Keyes' early life. The wilderness that surrounded him as a child had not just isolated him physically. It had hollowed out his empathy, replacing it with an analytical hunger for control. The silence he grew up in became the language of his mind, a quiet, internal world where morality was meaningless and power was everything. By the time he stepped into adulthood, Israel Keyes was fully formed, a man who had learned to hide his true self behind a mask of ordinariness. What the world would soon learn, though, was that behind that mask was not just another troubled soul, but the making of a predator who saw the entire world as his hunting ground. Chapter 3: Whispers in the Wilderness. The First Signs of Violence. By the mid-1990s, Israel Keyes was standing at the threshold of adulthood, carrying within him a dangerous cocktail of curiosity, intelligence, and emotional detachment. The wilderness that had once been his playground had become something else, a proving ground. Here, away from the scrutiny of others, he began to refine the behaviors that would one day make him one of the most elusive killers in American history. He had learned the art of concealment long before he ever killed a human being. To survive in the woods, he understood the value of patience, how to wait without movement, how to track without being seen, how to erase one's presence. These lessons, at first rooted in hunting animals, were slowly being applied to something darker. Israel Keyes was no longer simply practicing survival. He was rehearsing control. During his late teenage years, Keyes began to explore his impulses more openly. He had no friends, no mentors, and no one to confide in. His internal world had become detached from the ordinary rhythm of life. While his siblings and peers were learning to navigate adolescence through social connection, Keyes was learning how to manipulate and observe others from a distance. He rarely showed emotion, and when he did, it was carefully measured, a performance. Around this time, Keyes began breaking into homes. He didn't steal out of necessity or greed. The act itself was the thrill. He wanted to test his ability to move through someone else's world without being detected. He described these burglaries later as practice for something far greater. Each break-in was a psychological experiment. Could he control his fear, remain unnoticed, and leave behind no evidence? The answer, again and again, was yes. These early crimes taught him a crucial truth: that ordinary people lived in a false sense of safety. He saw how predictable they were, how easily they could be studied and exploited. Locked doors, bright lights, security systems. None of these, he realized, could protect them from someone willing to plan carefully enough. The next phase of his evolution came through his growing fascination with violence. He began to fantasize not only about control, but about the moment of taking life itself. He wanted to see how it would feel to dominate another person completely, to become, in his words, the only one in charge. The line between thought and action was thinning, and it was only a matter of time before he crossed it. One of the earliest incidents that revealed the shape of what was to come happened near Maupin, Oregon, where the Keys family had lived for a time. Israel was known to frequent isolated hiking trails and rivers. There, he once encountered a young girl and her friends, an event he would later describe in chilling detail to investigators. He admitted that he had planned to abduct and kill her, even preparing the location and means to dispose of the body. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the presence of others nearby, or perhaps it was his own calculation that the risk was too high. Either way, it was the moment when the idea of murder moved from imagination to reality. He had not yet killed, but he knew he wanted to. Keyes later said that he had made a promise to himself around that time. He would one day commit murder. It would not be spontaneous or emotional. It would be deliberate, methodical, and entirely under his control. He would wait until the time was right. And when that moment came, he would make sure no one ever connected him to it. That internal vow marked the true beginning of his descent. Over the next few years, Keyes would continue refining his methods. He began studying crime stories and police investigations, learning how killers were caught, and, more importantly, how they got away. He analyzed their mistakes, noting how impulsiveness, vanity, or carelessness led to their downfall. He wasn't just fascinated by killers. He was training himself to become a better one. Meanwhile, his outer life continued with quiet normalcy. He took on manual labor jobs, working in construction and carpentry. His skill with tools, precision, and planning made him a reliable worker. He preferred solitary tasks and disliked authority, but he was efficient and dependable. To those who met him, he seemed introverted but harmless, just another young man finding his place in the world. Yet inside, his mind was consumed by a private discipline, patience. Unlike many who act on dark impulses and bursts of chaos, Keyes was willing to wait for years if necessary. He saw killing not as compulsion, but as art, something to be perfected through study and restraint. As the 1990s drew to a close, he made his first significant move away from the constraints of his upbringing. Leaving behind the religious strictness of his parents, Keyes struck out on his own. He was finally free to create his own identity, and he used that freedom to sharpen the mask he would wear for the rest of his life. Around this period, he began developing the two defining qualities that would make him nearly impossible to catch: adaptability and detachment. He could blend into any environment, a trait he had learned from years of living on society's margins. Whether in a small town or a bustling city, he knew how to appear normal. He could smile at strangers, make polite conversation, and give off an aura of harmlessness. What truly set Keyes apart was not his violence, but his discipline. Even before he killed anyone, he had already constructed an internal code of conduct. He would choose victims randomly, avoid emotional attachment, and plan meticulously. He saw himself as a predator in a world of prey, and like any skilled hunter, he valued the process as much as the act itself. This emerging code would eventually make him one of the most methodical killers the FBI had ever encountered. But at this early stage, it was still an idea, a philosophy forming in the shadows of his mind. The wilderness that had once been a playground had now become a teacher. In nature, Keyes saw the simplicity of power. The strong take from the weak. The hunter controls the hunted. To him, it was not evil. It was balanced. He often spoke later about his admiration for predators, wolves, bears, and other apex hunters. They did not question their nature. They simply acted. He saw in them a reflection of his own worldview. That morality was an illusion, a human construct meant to restrain those too weak to embrace their instincts. To him, civilization was the real deception. The wilderness was honest, brutal, but pure. It was this belief that began to guide his every thought. He no longer felt any connection to humanity as a collective. He didn't hate people, but he didn't value them either. They were simply part of the landscape, like trees or rivers, existing until they became useful to his plans. In this quiet, deliberate way, Israel Keyes began transforming from a curious young man into something colder, a being driven not by passion, but by purpose. The world around him remained unaware. To them, he was just another quiet figure, passing through the ordinary rhythms of rural life. But deep within, something irreversible had taken hold, a whisper that would one day grow into a roar. The first signs of violence had begun to surface, but no one was listening. Not his parents, not his community, not even the world that would one day fear his name. For now, he remained hidden in plain sight, a predator still learning to move in silence. As Israel Keyes moved closer to adulthood, his skills in patience, observation, and concealment continued to sharpen. While most teenagers were exploring relationships, school, and social life, Keyes' focus was inward and deliberate, honing abilities that would later make him almost impossible to track. By the late 1990s, he had become a man whose fascination with control and planning was fully formed. Though outwardly he appeared unremarkable, even ordinary, Keyes' early adulthood coincided with his enlistment in the U.S. Army, a decision that would further refine his skills in discipline, planning, and strategy. The military provided him with structure, access to weapons, and a rigorous understanding of logistics, all of which he would later apply to his crimes. He was stationed at Fort Lewis in Washington and later at Fort Hood in Texas. His colleagues found him intelligent, composed, and methodical. He did not attract attention, nor did he seek it. To them, he was a competent soldier, a man who followed orders and executed tasks efficiently. Yet beneath this exterior was a mind actively calculating how to manipulate the world around him. The Army also introduced Keyes to travel in a way that was both practical and exhilarating for him. He learned how to navigate cities, highways, and remote areas with confidence. He understood the movement of people, the patterns of surveillance, and the limitations of law enforcement. These lessons would become vital later, when he turned the United States itself into a canvas for his crimes. The ability to move unseen, to act in one place and vanish to another, became a hallmark of his methodology. Around this same time, Keyes began what he later described as his kill kit preparation. He traveled across states, burying caches of weapons, ropes, masks, and other tools in remote areas. These kits were meticulously planned, often buried years in advance, and provided him with the resources to commit crimes anywhere without leaving a trail. This foresight was a defining trait. Keyes did not act impulsively. He acted strategically. Each kit was a promise of future control, a silent preparation for acts that would occur far from his home and his family. His targets were chosen not through emotional connection, but through detachment and randomness. He studied potential victims, their routines, and their vulnerabilities, but he deliberately avoided patterns that law enforcement could follow. Unlike other serial killers who kill close to home or within a predictable demographic, Keyes moved across regions, deliberately avoiding identification. To him, anonymity was power. While traveling and preparing, he continued living a normal life. He owned a small construction business in Alaska, spent time with his daughter, and maintained friendships and relationships that reinforced his outward normalcy. This dual existence, predator and father, killer and contractor, became a signature of Keyes' life. He compartmentalized so effectively that even those closest to him never suspected the man behind the mask. Despite this outward normalcy, early indicators of his dark impulses were present. Keyes' fascination with violence, control, and secrecy continued to deepen. He often spoke in later interviews about his desire to understand how people react to fear, pain, and death. He studied murderers not to emulate them, but to perfect his own approach, analyzing their mistakes and avoiding them. He admired killers who left minimal evidence and despised those who sought attention. He wanted his acts to be invisible, complete, controlled, and untraceable. One particularly chilling aspect of Keyes' early development was his understanding of psychology and manipulation. He could read people quickly, assess their fears, and predict their reactions. He learned how to appear trustworthy, unremarkable, and even likable. This skill allowed him to gain access to victims, conceal intentions, and maintain the illusion of normalcy. Every interaction, from casual conversations to professional meetings, was an opportunity to study human behavior, a rehearsal for eventual predation. By the early 2000s, Keyes had begun executing some of his first confirmed murders, though the timeline of his crimes remains partially unknown due to his meticulous erasure of evidence. These acts were not impulsive or reckless. Each murder followed careful planning, leveraging the kill kits he had prepared years earlier, and occurred far from familiar territory. He would often select locations that allowed him to travel undetected, leaving behind no witness or trace. Law enforcement agencies would later remark that his crimes were almost surgical in execution. Samantha Koenig's disappearance in 2012 would eventually expose Keyes, but even prior to that, he had killed in multiple states over more than a decade. The full scope of his murders remains uncertain, largely because he took extraordinary measures to cover his tracks. Investigators later revealed that he did not only commit homicide, he also stole, manipulated, and sometimes tortured his victims. Yet because of his foresight and planning, these acts remained invisible, often leaving law enforcement unaware of the true magnitude of his crimes. In his own reflections, Keyes described killing not as emotional or reactive, but as a process of control and mastery. He separated emotion entirely from the act, treating it as a professional exercise. The thrill he derived was not from rage or hatred, but from the complete domination of another human being, from exercising power in its purest, most deliberate form. He told investigators that he enjoyed the anticipation as much as the act itself, relishing the preparation, observation, and execution. This combination of patience, psychological manipulation, and geographic mobility made Keyes a uniquely modern serial killer. Unlike many historical offenders, he avoided the patterns that police relied upon, striking unpredictably and across vast distances. He did not crave fame or notoriety. In fact, he despised it. He sought only the control that came from remaining unseen, an invisible predator moving among the unsuspecting populace. As Keyes moved through these formative years of criminal activity, his philosophy crystallized. He would kill on his own terms, when he chose and where he chose. The wilderness of his childhood had taught him self-reliance, patience, and detachment. The military had refined discipline and strategy, and his travels had provided an understanding of anonymity and opportunity. Together, these factors created a man capable of extraordinary violence, executed with terrifying precision. By the time he committed his first fully confirmed murder, Israel Keyes was no longer a curious, detached teenager. He was a fully formed predator, a hunter whose skills, philosophy, and discipline made him nearly untouchable. He had learned to live in dual realities, one in which he was a normal, functioning member of society, and another in which he was the invisible architect of death. And it was in this duality that the full horror of Israel Keyes' capabilities would eventually be revealed. Chapter 4. Becoming the Hunter, From Soldier to Stalker. By the late 1990s, Israel Keyes had moved fully into adulthood, carrying with him the lessons of an isolated childhood, the discipline of military life, and a growing fascination with human behavior, control, and death. His transformation into a predator was not abrupt or impulsive. It was the culmination of years spent studying, observing, and rehearsing the mechanics of dominance. He had already committed acts of cruelty against animals and burglary, tested boundaries, and begun constructing the infrastructure that would later facilitate his murders. Yet at this stage, he was not merely planning. He was evolving into a hunter. Keyes' military experience provided the perfect environment to cultivate precision, strategy, and detachment. Enlisted in the late 1990s, he was trained in logistics, weapons handling, and survival, skills that would later serve him in the field of murder. He demonstrated intelligence and calm under pressure, earning respect from his peers for competence, but not forming close relationships. Social connections were unnecessary for him. Instead, he focused on understanding patterns, routines, and behavior, the very things that would make him a deadly stalker. While stationed at Fort Lewis and later Fort Hood, Keyes began to refine an internal philosophy that would govern his criminal career. He believed that true mastery lay in preparation and invisibility. Unlike impulsive criminals, he would act only when he had complete control, and he would take steps to ensure that the evidence could not lead back to him. His military training in map reading, survival, and strategic planning seamlessly integrated with his obsessive need for precision, creating a template for future killings. After leaving the Army, Keyes returned to civilian life with a heightened sense of purpose. He moved to Anchorage, Alaska, where he established a small construction business. By day, he was a contractor, a father, and a man blending effortlessly into the rhythms of ordinary life. By night, he traveled, observed, and honed his methods of predation. His dual existence was crucial. To maintain anonymity, he needed to appear normal, mundane, and trustworthy, even as he planned acts of extreme violence across the country. During this period, Keyes began to make travel a central element of his predation. He realized early that geographic mobility provided a buffer against detection. Most serial killers operate within a localized area, leaving patterns that law enforcement can detect. Keyes, however, leveraged airports, highways, and rental vehicles to move freely. He studied routes, timing, and logistics with the same precision a military strategist might use in planning an operation. Every journey became both an adventure and a rehearsal, a way to familiarize himself with potential hunting grounds. That a defining element of this stage in Keyes' evolution was the development of his kill kits. Years in advance, he would bury caches of weapons, tools, cash, and zip ties in remote locations. These caches were carefully mapped, often using natural landmarks, and contained everything he might need to commit murder far from home. The kill kits allowed him flexibility. He could strike almost anywhere without relying on chance or leaving behind evidence linking him to the act. To him, the kits were a guarantee of control, a physical manifestation of patience and foresight. Keyes' approach to victims during this period was clinical and detached. He did not hunt for revenge, sexual gratification, or rage. He hunted for control, precision, and mastery. Victims were selected randomly to avoid establishing patterns, and the act of killing was carried out in a methodical, unemotional manner. For him, the murder itself was a process, almost ritualistic, in which he exercised complete dominance over life and death. The duality of his existence required careful attention. In Anchorage, he participated in the life of a responsible adult. He paid bills, attended to his daughter, and maintained professional relationships. To acquaintances, he was ordinary, unremarkable, and polite. Yet beneath this surface, he meticulously monitored his own behaviors, ensuring that no trace of his criminal self leaked into the everyday world. This compartmentalization was central to his ability to operate undetected for years. KEYES' ability to read people also reached a new level during this time. He observed their habits, routines, and vulnerabilities with almost surgical precision. He noted which behaviors signaled trustworthiness, which indicated suspicion, and which moments of inattention could be exploited. This psychological acumen allowed him to approach victims subtly, often under the guise of friendliness or assistance. It was not charm, per se, but a studied mimicry of social norms designed to disarm and manipulate. Despite the outward normalcy of his life, KEYES' internal world was entirely consumed by preparation. He spent hours researching survival techniques, crime prevention methods, and investigative errors committed by law enforcement in past cases. He watched the news, read police reports, and studied the stories of other killers, always filtering what he learned through the lens of his own evolving methodology. Unlike impulsive criminals, KEYES' actions were deliberate, rehearsed, and calculated for long-term effectiveness. By the early 2000s, Israel KEYES had moved fully into the identity of the hunter. He was no longer merely planning or fantasizing. He was actively constructing the infrastructure, strategies, and psychological tools that would allow him to kill without detection. The wilderness of his childhood had taught him patience and self-reliance. The military had refined his skills in discipline and strategy. His adult experiences in Alaska provided anonymity and access. Together, these elements made him uniquely capable of executing crimes with a level of precision that law enforcement would later describe as extraordinary. What defined this stage of his life, however, was not only preparation but also self-imposed discipline. KEYES avoided reckless actions, impulsive behavior, and unnecessary exposure. Unlike many serial killers who draw attention to themselves, he valued invisibility above all else. The ability to remain unseen, both literally and psychologically, became a central tenet of his identity. This was the era when Israel KEYES truly became the hunter. Not merely a man with dark thoughts, but a predator actively developing the skills, tools, and strategies necessary to dominate life and death. The stage was set for what would follow in the next decade. A series of murders carried out across the United States, executed with meticulous care and designed to leave almost no trace. The quiet contractor in Anchorage had become a shadow moving across the nation, a ghost who hunted without remorse, observation, or pattern. As Israel KEYES transitioned fully into adulthood, his transformation from a quiet, isolated man into a nomadic predator became increasingly evident. By the early 2000s, he had developed a criminal methodology that was nearly unprecedented in its precision. Unlike other serial killers whose patterns often left clues, KEYES' approach was defined by meticulous planning, geographic mobility, and a chilling detachment from humanity. He had become what law enforcement would later call a modern, nomadic killer. KEYES' planning was obsessive. Every detail mattered. He tracked the movement of people, analyzed potential crime scenes, and selected locations with careful consideration. His kill kits, buried years in advance, ensured that he could commit murders without leaving a direct trail back to himself. These caches often included weapons, restraints, and other tools, each buried in remote areas mapped with precision. This preparation gave him flexibility. He could strike in almost any location without reliance on chance or risky improvisation. One of the defining traits of KEYES' method was randomness. Unlike many killers who target specific demographics or geographical areas, he deliberately avoided establishing a pattern. Victims were chosen opportunistically, often selected based on vulnerability and opportunity rather than personal characteristics. This unpredictability not only frustrated law enforcement, but also allowed Keyes to kill without leaving a traceable signature. He understood that predictability was the downfall of many killers. His crimes were designed to be untraceable, detached from motive or emotion. Psychologically, Keyes excelled at observation and manipulation. He could read people quickly, identify their fears, and exploit weaknesses with precision. To potential victims, he appeared ordinary, trustworthy, and even helpful. This ability to mimic social norms allowed him to approach people without raising suspicion. His outward normalcy, the calm contractor, the polite father, the quiet neighbor, was a deliberate mask, shielding the predator within. During this period, Keyes traveled extensively. Unlike stationary killers, he leveraged the mobility of modern life, airports, highways, and rental cars, to operate across state lines. He understood the limitations of law enforcement. Local police often focus on regional crimes, and federal investigations require time to link patterns. By striking far from home, he exploited these gaps. Geographic freedom became a cornerstone of his strategy, allowing him to commit murders in different states while maintaining the appearance of a normal life in Alaska. His dual existence was remarkably effective. To friends, neighbors, and his family, he was a reliable, hardworking man. He spent weekends with his daughter, performed construction work, and blended seamlessly into daily life. But beneath this veneer, he was constantly studying, planning, and perfecting his craft. Every interaction was a potential study in human behavior. Every journey was an opportunity to survey landscapes and identify future hunting grounds. That Keyes' early crimes during this era remained largely hidden. Some involved burglary, theft, or minor violence, serving as rehearsals for more serious acts. He tested his ability to control situations, remain undetected, and manipulate environments. Each act reinforced his confidence and further honed his skills. By the time he committed his first confirmed murder, Keyes had developed not only the physical tools, the kill kits and weapons, but also the psychological mastery to carry out his crimes with near-total impunity. An essential aspect of Keyes' evolution was his ability to separate emotion from action. Unlike many killers driven by anger, revenge, or sexual compulsion, he treated murder as a process, a deliberate exercise in control. He later described the act of killing in clinical terms: observation, preparation, execution, and disposal. There was no remorse, no emotional outburst, no need for validation. The thrill lay in the perfection of the act itself and the knowledge that he had complete power over life and death. His military background contributed significantly to this precision. Training in strategy, logistics, and survival had given him the tools to plan complex operations over extended distances. He approached murder with the same methodical mindset that one might approach a military operation, considering every variable, mitigating risks, and ensuring that contingency plans were in place. His kills were not impulsive. They were meticulously orchestrated performances executed with military-like discipline. By the mid-2000s, Keyes' crimes had reached a level of sophistication that made him almost invisible to law enforcement. Even when investigators discovered potential links between disappearances or unusual deaths, the lack of pattern, coupled with geographic randomness, made it nearly impossible to connect him to the crimes. He had become a ghost, a predator operating in the shadows of everyday life. What distinguished Keyes from other serial killers was not merely his violence, but the total control he exercised over every aspect of his life and crimes. He moved through the world unremarked, leaving almost no evidence, exploiting gaps in human awareness and institutional oversight. His ability to compartmentalize, to live as both ordinary citizen and calculated murderer, was extraordinary, and it allowed him to operate for more than a decade without detection. This period also marked the final formation of Keyes' philosophy. He believed that life itself was a game of control. People were predictable, vulnerable, and manipulable. Death was not a moral boundary, but a mechanism of power. To Keyes, the ultimate expression of dominance was the ability to take a life deliberately, with forethought and planning, and then vanish completely. This mindset would guide him through the years of killings that would later terrorize families across the United States. It'd be why the end of this stage in his life, Israel Keyes had fully assumed the identity of a modern nomadic killer. He was disciplined, detached, and methodical. He understood both human psychology and the mechanics of evading detection, and he had perfected the art of living invisibly among ordinary people. Every journey, every preparation, every act of observation was another step toward mastery. Keyes had become more than a man. He had become a predator of extraordinary calculation, a shadow moving silently across cities and towns, leaving nearly nothing in his wake but fear, speculation, and a trail of lives irrevocably changed. His era as the hunter was fully underway, and the consequences of his meticulously orchestrated violence would soon begin to unfold in ways that stunned the nation. Chapter 5. The First Confirmed Murders. Crossing the line. By the early 2000s, Israel Keyes had fully emerged as a predator, a man whose meticulous planning, psychological detachment, and nomadic lifestyle converged into a singular purpose: to kill with precision, control, and invisibility. The years of observation, practice, and preparation were about to culminate in the first confirmed murders that would mark the transition from fantasy and rehearsal to lethal reality. That Keyes' first confirmed murders were not impulsive. They were calculated, deliberate, and carefully executed, using the tools and knowledge he had amassed over years of preparation. He had studied law enforcement, analyzed other serial killers, and perfected his ability to manipulate and deceive. Each action was purposeful, designed to maximize control and minimize risk. For Keyes, the act of killing was not an eruption of emotion. It was a demonstration of mastery over life and death. His first known victim was Bill Courier, a man abducted from an airport in Alaska in February 2001. Keyes had traveled extensively and had buried a kill kit in advance, a hallmark of his strategic approach. Courier was selected not because of any personal connection, but because he fit the profile Keyes had developed: vulnerable, unsuspecting, and in a location that allowed Keyes to operate without detection. The victim's disappearance, however, would remain unsolved for years, a testament to Keyes' skill at covering his tracks. Following the first murders, Keyes continued to refine his methods. He did not rush. He waited months, even years, between killings, following a philosophy of patience that was as much a part of his identity as his meticulous planning. Each murder was rehearsed in his mind, mapped against the environment, and executed only when every detail aligned. His meticulous nature made him exceptionally dangerous. He was able to commit murder without leaving the predictable patterns that law enforcement typically relies upon. One of the most chilling aspects of Keyes' methodology was his use of kill kits. Years before a murder, he would select remote locations across the United States and bury weapons, restraints, and other tools. When the time came to strike, he simply traveled to the prearranged site, retrieved the tools, and executed the murder. This foresight allowed him to strike anywhere, without relying on chance or leaving evidence that could link him to the crime. Keyes' geographic mobility was equally important. Unlike killers who operate within a fixed radius of home, Keyes moved freely across the country. He traveled extensively, often for construction work or personal reasons, but also to scout locations and prepare for future crimes. This constant movement made it almost impossible for law enforcement to connect the dots, as his crimes were spread across multiple jurisdictions and often separated by months or years. His victims were chosen randomly, further complicating detection. They were not connected to him personally, and he avoided targeting anyone within his immediate community. Keyes' focus was not revenge, lust, or rage. It was control and precision. He wanted to ensure that every aspect of the murder was under his command, from abduction to execution to disposal. This cold, calculating approach set him apart from many serial killers who act out of compulsion or emotion. Psychologically, Keyes was as disciplined as he was detached. He carefully observed human behavior, noting vulnerabilities and habits. When approaching a victim, he could appear unremarkable, trustworthy, even helpful. This ability to blend in, coupled with meticulous preparation, allowed him to abduct and murder without raising suspicion. He treated his victims as objects, elements in a controlled experiment rather than human beings. This detachment was a defining feature of his criminal identity. The murders of the early 2000s also demonstrated Keyes' understanding of law enforcement limitations. He knew that local police often focus on regional patterns, that federal agencies require time to link cases, and that random, unconnected disappearances could easily be overlooked. By spreading his killings across states and years, he effectively exploited gaps in policing. His ability to plan, wait, and move freely made him one of the most elusive killers in modern history. Keyes' early murders were also remarkable for their lack of post-crime behavior. He did not seek attention, thrill, or validation. Unlike other killers, he did not revisit the crime scene, taunt authorities, or leave signatures. The act of murder itself was the culmination of planning, observation, and execution, the ultimate expression of control. He rarely took trophies or keepsakes, understanding that anything left behind could compromise his anonymity. During this period, Keyes' personal life remained outwardly normal. In Alaska, he continued working as a contractor, caring for his daughter, and maintaining relationships that reinforced his image as an ordinary man. To those around him, there was nothing remarkable or alarming. The predator existed in parallel to the citizen, carefully compartmentalized and hidden behind the facade of normalcy. This duality would continue to define his criminal career, allowing him to operate for over a decade before capture. In the first confirmed murders, Keyes' evolution as a killer became evident. The patience of childhood isolation, the precision of military training, the foresight of kill kits, and the detachment from human emotion coalesced into a uniquely effective predatory approach. Each crime was an extension of a philosophy that valued preparation, control, and invisibility above all else. The early 2000s marked the moment Keyes crossed the threshold from thought to action, from planning to execution. The wilderness that had shaped him, the solitude that had honed him, and the knowledge that he had acquired over years of observation converged in lethal practice. He was no longer merely a man with dark thoughts. He had become a hunter capable of striking anywhere, at any time, without leaving traces that could lead back to him. The significance of these first confirmed murders cannot be overstated. They were not the acts of a young man testing boundaries. They were the calculated, deliberate actions of a fully realized predator. Keyes had crossed the line, moving from preparation and fantasy into the execution of his deadly philosophy. And as the nation would later discover, these were only the beginning. After the initial confirmed murders in the early 2000s, Israel Keyes' confidence and methodical approach only intensified. He had crossed the threshold from planning to execution, and the success of his first killings reinforced his philosophy. Patience, preparation, and control were paramount. Unlike impulsive offenders, Keyes was driven not by emotion, compulsion, or rage, but by the meticulous pursuit of dominance. Every subsequent act was an extension of the strategy he had developed over years. One of the hallmarks of Keyes' murders during this period was geographic unpredictability. He deliberately selected victims far from his home, often in locations where he could operate undetected. Alaska, with its sparse population and vast wilderness, provided the perfect setting for some of his earliest confirmed murders, but Keyes was already traveling extensively across the United States. Airports, rental cars, highways, and long-distance travel became tools in his arsenal, allowing him to strike anywhere without establishing a pattern. The use of kill kits, buried years in advance, exemplified Keyes' level of foresight. These kits contained everything he might need: weapons, restraints, zip ties, gloves, masks, and sometimes cash. By pre-staging these items in remote locations, he could abduct and murder victims without relying on opportunistic tools or leaving evidence behind. This preparation was not haphazard. It was an intricate system, reflecting his military training and obsessive attention to detail. That Keyes' choice of victims was striking in its randomness. Unlike serial killers who target specific demographics, he avoided establishing patterns that could be detected by law enforcement. He abducted men and women of varying ages, social backgrounds, and ethnicities. This randomness served multiple purposes. It frustrated investigations, reduced the likelihood of detection, and reinforced his belief that life itself was an arena for his control. Victims were objects to be studied, manipulated, and ultimately eliminated, devoid of personal connection or motive. The psychological manipulation Keyes employed was exceptional. He could appear trustworthy, helpful, and unremarkable, allowing him to approach victims without arousing suspicion. His calm demeanor, polite speech, and ordinary appearance masked the predator within. He observed human behavior closely, noting reactions, routines, and vulnerabilities. Every interaction was a rehearsal, every observation a step toward mastery. That Keyes' murders were characterized by detachment and precision. Unlike impulsive killers, he did not act in fits of rage or emotion. Each abduction and killing followed a careful plan, executed with near surgical accuracy. He controlled the timing, location, and method of each murder, often taking pleasure in the anticipation as much as the act itself. The thrill for Keyes was not in violence as a release, but in the perfection of the process and the exercise of absolute control over another human being. Even as he committed these murders, Keyes maintained a dual existence. In his day-to-day life, he was a contractor, a father, and a seemingly ordinary citizen. He attended to responsibilities, cared for his daughter, and maintained relationships that reinforced his image as a normal man. This compartmentalization was essential. By appearing unremarkable and engaged in normal activities, he avoided suspicion and continued to operate under the radar. The first confirmed murders also highlighted Keyes' understanding of law enforcement limitations. He exploited jurisdictional boundaries, the gaps between local and federal investigations, and the assumptions investigators often make about serial offenders. By varying locations, methods, and victim profiles, he avoided detection. Unlike many killers who leave trails, post on the internet, or taunt authorities, Keyes' objective was invisibility. His crimes were almost surgical in nature, leaving minimal physical or circumstantial evidence. During this time, Keyes' confidence in his methods grew. He began to see himself as a master of his craft, a hunter operating with complete autonomy and precision. The combination of preparation, observation, and psychological detachment allowed him to move through society unnoticed, while committing acts that would terrify anyone who later uncovered them. He described the act of murder as a series of calculated steps, each under his control, each reinforcing his sense of power and mastery. It was also during this period that Keyes' criminal philosophy fully crystallized. He viewed life itself as a system of opportunities and vulnerabilities, and he positioned himself at the apex. To him, morality was irrelevant. The only consideration was control. The wilderness of his childhood, the discipline of his military experience, and the skills he honed through years of observation had combined to create a predator uniquely adapted to operate in the modern world. By the mid-2000s, Keyes had established himself as a modern nomadic killer. He had developed the tools, methods, and psychological framework to kill without detection. His first confirmed murders were not anomalies or experiments. They were the beginning of a deliberate, calculated campaign that would continue for more than a decade. He was patient, precise, and entirely methodical, a shadow moving invisibly across states, leaving a trail of lives forever altered. The significance of these first confirmed murders lies not only in the victims themselves, but in what they reveal about Keyes' methodology. He was not a compulsive killer. He was a planner, a thinker, a strategist. His approach combined military precision, psychological acumen, and forensic foresight. He had learned from his childhood, honed through years of observation, and perfected over countless hours of preparation. In essence, the first confirmed murders marked the full emergence of Israel Keyes as a modern serial killer, a predator defined by patience, invisibility, and absolute control. These early acts laid the foundation for a decade-long killing spree that would ultimately shock the nation and challenge law enforcement's understanding of mobility, methodical violence, and predation. Chapter 6. The Nomadic Killings, spanning states and years. By the mid-2000s, Israel Keyes had fully evolved into a predator of remarkable discipline, strategic thinking, and chilling detachment. His first confirmed murders had established the framework of his criminal philosophy, and now he was entering the next stage of his career, a nomadic spree of killings that would stretch across states, years, and unsuspecting communities. Unlike most serial killers, Keyes' crimes were not confined by geography, demographic patterns, or impulsive emotion. Instead, they were calculated exercises in control, anonymity, and precision. Keyes' mobility was a key factor in his ability to evade detection. Unlike traditional offenders who operate within a known radius, he traveled extensively, both for work and for planning. He used rental cars, commercial flights, and long stretches of highway to reach remote locations, often far from the places he lived. By distancing himself from both victims and crime scenes, he avoided the patterns that investigators rely on to link murders together. Every journey became both a scouting mission and a rehearsal, allowing him to identify locations for future kill kits or potential abductions. The kill kits themselves were a hallmark of his nomadic methodology. These caches, buried months or even years in advance, contained tools designed for maximum efficiency: weapons, restraints, gloves, masks, and sometimes cash. They were carefully concealed in remote areas, often marked by natural landmarks that only Keyes could recognize. This pre-planning allowed him to commit murder with minimal risk and no dependency on impromptu tools. He could strike almost anywhere, leaving no trail that connected him to the crime. Unlike impulsive killers, Keyes exercised extreme patience. He would often wait months, even years, between murders, using the intervening time to observe, plan, and perfect his methods. He saw killing as a craft, a series of controlled operations rather than a release of emotion or compulsion. This patience, combined with his detachment, enabled him to operate under the radar, moving seamlessly between ordinary life and violent predation without detection. Victim selection during this period was deliberately random, a strategy designed to obscure patterns and complicate investigations. Keyes did not target people he knew personally, nor did he restrict his choices to specific demographics. Men and women of varying ages and backgrounds became potential victims, selected for vulnerability and opportunity rather than personal motive. This randomness frustrated law enforcement and added to his elusiveness. By removing patterns, he ensured that even if authorities were aware of a disappearance, they could not easily connect it to him. That Keyes' psychological manipulation was equally sophisticated. He could appear trustworthy, polite, and helpful, allowing him to gain access to victims without raising suspicion. He studied human behavior closely, identifying routines, fears, and vulnerabilities. Every interaction, whether casual or seemingly mundane, was an exercise in observation. He perfected the art of blending in, appearing ordinary while concealing a predator within. This combination of observation, patience, and mimicry allowed him to execute abductions and murders with remarkable efficiency. The murders themselves were executed with meticulous care. Keyes' approach was methodical and detached. He viewed the act of killing as a process: preparation, observation, execution, and disposal. There was no emotional frenzy, no need for revenge or validation. Instead, he took satisfaction in the control and precision he exercised over life and death. Each murder reinforced his belief in his own mastery and the effectiveness of his strategies. Keyes' nomadic strategy also reflected a keen understanding of law enforcement limitations. He knew that local police primarily investigate crimes within their jurisdiction and that federal agencies require time to link cases across states. By operating across multiple regions, he effectively exploited gaps in investigative coordination. His murders were separated by geography and time, making it nearly impossible to detect connections until much later, if at all. During this period, Keyes maintained a remarkably normal outward life. He continued to work as a contractor, cared for his daughter, and participated in community activities that reinforced the perception of normalcy. This dual existence was critical to his strategy. By presenting himself as an ordinary, responsible adult, he avoided scrutiny and suspicion. To the world, he was unremarkable. To those he preyed upon, he was a deadly, invisible force. While traveling and killing, Keyes remained disciplined. He avoided careless mistakes, vanity, and impulsive actions that often lead killers to capture. Every murder was carefully orchestrated, minimizing risk and exposure. His attention to detail, combined with psychological acumen and physical preparation, made him one of the most elusive killers in modern American history. Keyes' nomadic killing spree also reflected his philosophy of control. Life, to him, was a system of opportunities and vulnerabilities, and he positioned himself at the apex. Death was not a moral boundary, but a demonstration of dominance. This mindset, shaped by a childhood in isolation, refined through military discipline, and perfected through years of preparation, defined the crimes he would commit over the next decade. By the mid-2000s, Israel Keyes had become a ghost moving across the United States. He struck silently, unpredictably, and with methodical precision. His victims were carefully chosen, his actions rehearsed and executed flawlessly, and his tracks meticulously erased. The combination of mobility, patience, detachment, and preparation made him uniquely capable of committing murders across states without detection. The early nomadic killings laid the foundation for what would later be recognized as one of the most chilling serial killing methodologies in American history. Keyes was no longer simply a man with murderous impulses. He was a predator operating on his own terms, a calculating force moving invisibly through communities, leaving devastation in his wake while the world remained oblivious. As the 2000s progressed, Israel Keyes' crimes became increasingly sophisticated, demonstrating a level of patience, planning, and mobility unmatched by most serial killers. By now, he had refined his methodology to near perfection. The combination of geographic randomness, prepositioned kill kits, and psychological manipulation allowed him to commit murders with almost total invisibility. Unlike other offenders whose compulsions often led them to repeat patterns, Keyes' deliberate and controlled approach made him extraordinarily difficult to track. The Keyes' nomadic killing spree spanned multiple states, often separated by months or even years. He understood that distance and time were his allies. By committing crimes far from his home base in Alaska, he effectively insulated himself from local scrutiny. Airports, interstate highways, and rental vehicles provided him with the means to move freely, while the pre-buried kill kits ensured that he could act efficiently without leaving evidence behind. Each murder was, in essence, a remote operation executed with surgical precision. One chilling element of Keyes' methodology was his meticulous victim selection process. He did not target anyone he knew personally, nor did he focus on a particular age group, gender, or social class. Victims were chosen randomly, typically based on opportunity and vulnerability. This randomness served multiple purposes. It made pattern recognition by law enforcement nearly impossible, minimized the likelihood of detection, and reinforced Keyes' belief in the predator-prey dynamic that governed his worldview. He saw people as objects to manipulate and control rather than as individuals with intrinsic value. Keyes' psychological manipulation remained a critical component of his crimes. He could appear unremarkable, trustworthy, and even friendly, allowing him to gain the confidence of potential victims. This skill enabled him to abduct individuals without arousing suspicion, blending seamlessly into society while preparing for the act of murder. Observing human behavior became a form of training for Keyes. He noted routines, weaknesses, and reactions, refining his ability to control both environment and victim. The murders themselves were carried out with extreme discipline. Keyes treated each act as a controlled operation, emphasizing preparation, execution, and the careful removal of evidence. He often studied crime reports and investigative mistakes committed by other killers, ensuring that he avoided errors that could expose him. Unlike impulsive offenders, he derived satisfaction from the methodical nature of the crime, the anticipation, and the complete dominance over the victim. For Keyes, the process was as thrilling as the act itself. Another defining characteristic of this period was Keyes' ability to exploit jurisdictional limitations. He understood that law enforcement agencies often operate within specific geographic boundaries, with limited communication across state lines. By committing murders in different states, sometimes years apart, he minimized the risk of being linked to multiple crimes. His crimes were intentionally scattered, leaving investigators struggling to connect disappearances or deaths that shared no obvious pattern. Despite his nomadic predation, Keyes maintained a semblance of normalcy in his daily life. He continued working as a contractor in Alaska, cared for his daughter, and interacted with neighbors, friends, and colleagues in ways that reinforced his ordinary image. This dual life was crucial to his survival. By maintaining social plausibility, he avoided suspicion and continued his criminal activities undetected. The contrast between the domestic KEYES and the predator operating across states underscores the extraordinary compartmentalization he mastered. During these years, KEYES' philosophy of control and invisibility became fully ingrained. He believed that life itself was a system of vulnerabilities, and his objective was to exploit them with precision. Moral or ethical considerations were irrelevant. The only measure of success was whether he could execute a murder and leave without trace or consequence. This mindset, honed through childhood isolation, military discipline, and years of calculated practice, defined the entirety of his nomadic killing strategy. Keyes' ability to remain unnoticed also relied on his careful avoidance of impulsive behavior. He did not seek media attention, avoid law enforcement confrontations, and rarely left post-crime evidence. Unlike other killers who are eventually caught due to arrogance or mistakes, Keyes' patience and discipline allowed him to operate undisturbed. Each murder reinforced his confidence and further solidified the operational protocols he had developed over a decade of careful planning. The scale of his nomadic killings revealed a unique threat, a killer who could strike anywhere, anytime, without detection. His crimes were separated by geography and time, leaving investigators with minimal evidence and no discernible pattern. Each act demonstrated his ability to combine preparation, manipulation, and mobility into a lethal and invisible force. By the late 2000s, Keyes had perfected his identity as a nomadic predator. His kill kits, his mobility, and his psychological acumen created a level of operational security that few law enforcement agencies had ever encountered. He was a shadow moving across the United States, striking unpredictably and disappearing without trace. Communities were left devastated, families confused, and law enforcement frustrated, unaware that a single man was responsible for a string of murders spanning years and states. Keyes' nomadic killings were not only about murder. They were exercises in mastery, patience, and control. Each operation reaffirmed his belief in his own superiority, the efficacy of preparation, and the predictability of human vulnerability. By operating across vast distances and long time frames, he created a system of invisibility that allowed him to remain one step ahead of authorities, establishing a level of predatory sophistication that remains unmatched in modern criminal history. Chapter 7: Techniques of a Ghost, Methods, Tools, and Kill Kits. By the late 2000s, Israel Keyes had evolved into a predator whose methods were unparalleled in their meticulousness, foresight, and adaptability. His nomadic approach to murder, combined with a complete detachment from emotion, allowed him to operate across the United States with near-total invisibility. What set him apart was not merely his ability to kill, but the systematic precision with which he prepared for each act. Keyes' crimes were exercises in control, rehearsed and executed with a level of discipline that bordered on military strategy, reflecting the influence of his army training and the isolation of his formative years. Central to Keyes' method was his use of kill kits, a concept that would later shock law enforcement investigators. These kits, buried months or even years in advance, were pre-stocked with weapons, restraints, gloves, masks, and sometimes cash, everything he might need to commit a murder far from home. Each kit was carefully hidden in remote areas, often marked with natural landmarks or other subtle indicators that only Keyes could interpret. The kits allowed him to act opportunistically, striking when circumstances were favorable while maintaining complete anonymity. They were, in essence, tools of absolute control. Keyes' planning process was methodical and deliberate. He studied potential locations for accessibility, concealment, and escape routes, ensuring that each site minimized the risk of detection. Unlike impulsive offenders, he did not rely on luck or improvisation. Every detail, from timing to disposal of evidence, was considered. He even calculated the optimal times to strike, often choosing moments when the probability of interruption or observation was lowest. This level of foresight allowed him to operate across multiple states without establishing a discernible pattern. The methods Keyes employed in committing murder were equally calculated. He preferred abduction over opportunistic killing, targeting individuals who presented both vulnerability and minimal risk of immediate identification. His approach was deliberate. He would gain the victim's trust, often under the guise of casual interaction or assistance, then isolate them and execute the crime with premeditated efficiency. This detachment from emotion or impulse was central to his success, allowing him to maintain calm and control throughout the entire process. Psychological manipulation was another critical aspect of Keyes' technique. He could read body language, detect fear or trust, and adjust his behavior to gain compliance. Unlike other killers who rely on brute force or intimidation alone, Keyes combined charm, deception, and patience to manipulate victims into vulnerability. He observed reactions meticulously, often rehearsing potential outcomes in his mind before ever acting. This strategic approach to human behavior made him exceptionally dangerous, as he rarely relied on coercion alone. The act of compliance was often secured before physical intervention. Keyes' kill kits also reflected a sophisticated understanding of logistics. He buried them in locations that were both remote and accessible, ensuring that he could retrieve them with minimal exposure. Some kits were prepared years in advance, demonstrating foresight that few criminals ever achieve. This premeditation allowed him to commit murders in unfamiliar areas without reliance on local resources or improvisation, effectively making him self-sufficient and extraordinarily difficult to track. The kits were not just tools. They were strategic investments in his criminal operations. In addition to physical preparation, Keyes demonstrated an extraordinary ability to compartmentalize. He maintained a normal daily life while simultaneously executing plans for murder across the country. Outwardly, he was a contractor, a father, and a neighbor, blending seamlessly into society. Internally, he rehearsed abductions, studied law enforcement limitations, and refined his psychological strategies. This dual existence allowed him to operate undetected for years, maintaining a facade of normalcy while systematically carrying out violent crimes. Keyes' methods were also informed by a deep understanding of law enforcement practices. He studied investigative reports, police procedures, and the errors of other criminals. He was aware of the ways evidence could be traced, patterns could be detected, and mistakes could lead to capture. By learning from these observations, he adjusted his strategies, minimizing forensic traces and avoiding behaviors that might attract attention. This constant self-assessment and refinement elevated his methodology beyond that of most contemporary serial killers. One striking aspect of Keyes' operations was his use of geographic and temporal distance as a tool of evasion. He would commit murders far from his home, often in locations unrelated to his work or personal life. Furthermore, he frequently allowed months or years to pass between killings, reducing the likelihood of pattern detection. This approach required patience, discipline, and meticulous record-keeping in his own mind. He memorized the locations of kill kits, escape routes, and other logistical details rather than relying on physical notes, which could be discovered. Even the act of disposal was executed with calculated care. Keyes preferred locations that were isolated and difficult to access, ensuring that the remains of his victims were unlikely to be found quickly, if at all. The combination of remote sites, careful timing, and strategic preparation allowed him to remain undetected despite committing murders over a span of more than a decade. Each act reinforced his operational philosophy: preparation, control, and invisibility above all else. By the end of this period, Keyes' identity as a predator had crystallized. He was no longer merely a man who killed. He had become a ghost, a figure who moved invisibly through society, striking unpredictably and leaving minimal trace. His methods reflected years of meticulous planning, a profound understanding of human behavior, and an unprecedented ability to exploit geography and timing. He was disciplined, detached, and ruthlessly methodical, embodying a form of predation that law enforcement had rarely encountered. Israel Keyes' techniques were the foundation of his notoriety. The combination of kill kits, strategic mobility, psychological manipulation, and careful planning made him a uniquely modern serial killer, one who leveraged the logistical advantages of contemporary life to operate across the United States while remaining virtually undetected. His methods were not just tools of murder. They were expressions of his philosophy: absolute control, deliberate execution, and the art of invisibility. Israel Keyes' methods were not random improvisations. They were the product of a man who rehearsed violence as if preparing for an operation. In Part 1, we examined the kill kits, the pre-buried caches, the psychological manipulation and geographic distance that allowed him to vanish behind a facade of ordinariness. In this continuation, the focus shifts to the finer, quieter details: how Keyes coordinated logistics, the small decisions that made detection unlikely, the technologies he avoided or exploited, and the natural systems he used as partners in concealment. Keyes treated every murder like a project that required a timeline, materials, and contingency plans. He was methodical in the smallest ways: the choice of shoes he wore to avoid leaving identifiable tread marks, the way he handled cash to avoid creating a paper trail, the attention to scent control to minimize the chance of detection by animals or trained dogs. These were not accidental precautions. They reflected a mindset that anticipated investigative responses and preemptively closed off likely avenues for discovery. Small precautions multiplied into a posture of near-impenetrable operational security. Technology presented both a threat and a tool. Keyes knew the reach of cameras, credit card records, and cell phone towers, and he made conscious choices to minimize his digital footprint. He rarely used a credit card when traveling to or from a location where he intended to commit violence. He often preferred cash purchases and would avoid hotels with known surveillance. When he flew, he did not seek frequent flyer benefits that would record his patterns. Conversely, he used technology strategically. Communications he did use were minimal and transient, and when he needed to book transport, he favored options that produced the least retrievable trail. He understood that in the modern world, the most secure behavior is often the one that looks most ordinary. His logistical playbook extended to vehicles. Keyes favored rental cars and vehicles that would not tie back to him. When driving out to remote kill kit locations, he planned routes that reduced the likelihood of passing populated checkpoints or being caught on traffic cameras. He timed trips to avoid typical commuting hours and randomized travel windows to prevent pattern formation. He understood that a rental logged at an airport was less suspicious than repeated local rentals, and that short, bursty travel patterns were easier to explain than long, recurring ones. Each movement was a balance between practicality and plausible deniability. Keyes also mastered the art of misdirection. He would sometimes scout areas months in advance, conducting benign-seeming activities that made his presence appear ordinary, visiting local businesses, asking for directions, or taking casual photos of landscapes. These acts created a paper-thin context that could later make investigators consider him a passerby or tourist rather than a predator. The mundane activities were the perfect camouflage, ordinary behaviors that erased suspicion and rewrote the narrative of his presence in a place. Another silent pillar of his technique was patience with time itself. Keyes did not need immediate gratification. He was content to let years pass between crimes if that reduced the risk of detection. Time was a weapon. The longer he waited, the more the trail cooled, witnesses' memories blurred, and physical evidence degraded. He relied on the natural entropy of information. People move, files are archived, tips dry up. That understanding made him comfortable with long gaps between murders and gave him the flexibility to strike when conditions were most favorable. Keyes' emotional detachment was an operational advantage. The absence of a need to revisit scenes, to advertise, or to collect souvenirs meant fewer opportunities for emotional errors. Many serial offenders are ultimately undone by compulsions that lead to repeat exposure. Keyes avoided that entirely. He did not crave recognition. His gratification was the successful completion of the plan and the knowledge that it remained unnoticed. This internal reward system reduced his behavioral noise. No trophies, no taunts, no dramatics. Only silence afterward. One of the most unsettling aspects of Keyes' operations was how he used the environments themselves as partners in concealment. He favored places where weather patterns, wildlife activity, and terrain aided disappearance. He buried kill kits in soil types that discouraged obvious disturbance, chose access routes over land that was infrequently traversed, and used seasonal changes to obscure evidence. He understood natural cycles and exploited them, timing some actions to coincide with seasons when foliage or thawing would make discovery less likely. Nature, in his calculations, covered and confused. Keyes also thought in contingencies. He always had a plan B, plan C, and sometimes plan D. If retrieval of a kit was threatened by unexpected human activity, he had alternate sites to use, and he sometimes carried emergency tools to improvise. His kits often contained redundant items, extra bindings, alternate blade types, and varied methods of concealment. This redundancy reduced the chance that a single failure would unravel the rest of the operation. The goal was not just to execute a crime, but to ensure that a single mistake wouldn't lead to exposure. The way he disposed of evidence was deliberate and aimed at maximizing ambiguity. In some cases, he buried remains deeply. In others, he scattered components across vast areas. Sometimes he transported remains to places unlikely to be connected. He appreciated that the absence of a clear cause of death or the involvement of multiple jurisdictions complicated investigations. By orchestrating ambiguity, leaving intentional gaps in the trail, he leveraged the complexity of human systems to his advantage. That ambiguity reduced the chances that any single detective, department, or family would be able to reconstruct the full picture. Keyes was also acutely aware of human factors, how communities react to trauma, and how families and officials search for closure. He understood the tendency of investigators to look for personal motives, local suspects, or patterns tied to geography or victimology. He intentionally avoided these investigative heuristics. His randomness exploited them. When communities rallied to search for missing persons, he sometimes inserted himself into searches or community efforts under the guise of concern. thereby maintaining his camouflage while surveying responses and openings. Despite his operational ruthlessness, Keyes displayed a form of professional pride in his own system. He spoke about his crimes like an engineer describing efficient processes. Each element minimized risk, maximized control, and favored plausible deniability. That perspective is chilling because it reduces human life to variables and operations, an ethos that made him efficient and nearly invisible. For him, success was measured by the absence of consequence rather than by any public recognition. Law enforcement would later describe Keyes as methodical in ways that challenged conventional profiling. He did not fit the pattern of a localized, hobbyist, or sexually motivated serial offender. Instead, he operated with the detached efficiency of someone who had internalized the mechanics of invisibility as a way of life. The practices he adopted, pre-burial, redundancy, timing, misdirection, exploitation of jurisdictional gaps, are now studied by investigators trying to understand how killers can exploit modern mobility and institutional fragmentation. Chapter 8. The Dark Psychology. Inside Israel Keyes' mind. By the time of his nomadic killing spree, Israel Keyes had not only perfected his methodology, but had also cultivated a psychological profile that was as chilling as it was complex. Unlike many serial killers whose motivations are immediately apparent, anger, sexual compulsion, revenge, Keyes' motives were abstract, philosophical, and rooted in a deep, systematic understanding of human behavior. He saw people as variables in a system of control and death as a mechanism of ultimate dominance. To understand Keyes, one must delve into the isolation, upbringing, and thought patterns that forged his detached, yet highly strategic mind. Keyes' early life had been marked by isolation and hardship. Raised in rural Alaska, he experienced both the physical and emotional seclusion of life in sparsely populated areas. From a young age, he exhibited an unusual degree of self-reliance, often engaging in solitary activities and developing a fascination with survival and control. Hunting, fishing, and wilderness exploration nurtured skills of patience and observation, traits that would later translate directly into his predatory methodology. This isolation also allowed for the cultivation of a mental landscape largely uninfluenced by social constraints, creating fertile ground for his early fantasies of power and control. Throughout his youth, Keyes displayed characteristics now associated with antisocial and psychopathic behavior. He was highly manipulative, capable of lying convincingly, and showed a disregard for conventional social rules. Unlike many adolescents, Keyes did not seek approval or attention. Instead, he focused on understanding systems and people, analyzing the world around him in detached, almost clinical ways. He honed the ability to observe without attachment, a skill that would later enable him to identify vulnerabilities in potential victims with frightening precision. Military service played a pivotal role in sharpening Keyes' psychological tools. In the Army, he was trained in discipline, logistics, and operational planning. He absorbed lessons in strategy, situational awareness, and preparation, applying them not to combat or duty, but to his own internal calculus of control and predation. The structure of military life provided both the framework and the language for a mind already inclined toward planning, observation, and meticulous attention to detail. Each aspect of his training, from route planning to resource management, was repurposed in his later crimes. Central to Keyes' psychological profile was detachment from morality and empathy. He did not kill out of anger or emotional compulsion. Instead, he approached murder as a process, analyzing risk, opportunity, and execution. In his own accounts after capture, He described murders in terms of logistics and outcomes rather than personal or emotional experience. This extreme detachment allowed him to commit acts that would horrify most people while remaining calm, calculated, and focused on the mechanics of control. That Keyes' internal reward system was unique. Unlike killers who seek attention, validation, or notoriety, he derived satisfaction from the successful execution of his plan and the maintenance of anonymity. He rarely, if ever, took trophies or keepsakes. The act of killing itself, done cleanly, without trace, and without detection, was the source of gratification. This removed one of the most common vulnerabilities in serial offenders: the need to relive the crime, to boast, or to leave evidence that could lead to capture. Observation and manipulation were central pillars of Keyes' psychology. He could read people with astonishing accuracy, detecting fear, trust, or hesitation in seconds. He adjusted his demeanor to gain compliance and create vulnerability. To Keyes, human behavior was predictable if studied carefully. People could be guided, nudged, and controlled. This ability to exploit psychology allowed him to abduct victims with minimal resistance, relying more on cunning than on force. That Keyes' detachment extended to emotional relationships as well. While he maintained a public persona as a father, neighbor, and contractor, these roles were compartmentalized from his internal predatory identity. He could display care, warmth, and reliability when it suited him, yet his inner life remained dominated by strategic calculation. This duality made him extraordinarily difficult to detect, as outward appearances were almost entirely divorced from internal intentions. Another defining psychological trait was patience as a weapon. Keyes did not rush into murder. He often waited months or years to act, using the intervening time to study environments, monitor routines, and ensure optimal conditions. Time itself became part of his method. While other killers act impulsively, Keyes' patience allowed him to operate almost like a chess master, anticipating moves, preparing contingencies, and striking only when the outcome was maximally in his favor. Even his enjoyment of violence was intellectualized rather than emotional. He spoke of killing as an art of control rather than an emotional release. This perspective is consistent with traits of extreme psychopathy: emotional detachment, lack of empathy, and a focus on strategic dominance rather than gratification. The thrill for Keyes came not from the suffering inflicted, but from the demonstration of mastery, the ability to impose his will on another human being without consequence. Understanding Keyes' mind requires recognizing the synergy between his upbringing, his military training, and his innate psychological tendencies. Isolation fostered self-reliance and observation. Military discipline reinforced strategic thinking. Psychopathy provided detachment and fearless execution. Together, these factors produced a mind capable of operating with extraordinary efficiency, patience, and invisibility. By the late 2000s, Keyes had internalized a philosophy that guided every aspect of his life and crimes. People were variables, life was a system of vulnerabilities, and death was an instrument of control. He viewed himself not as a participant in society, but as an observer and manipulator, capable of navigating human systems without detection. This worldview, chilling in its rationality, informed every decision, from the selection of victims to the timing and location of murders to the concealment of evidence. Continuing to explore the inner workings of Israel Keyes' mind, it becomes clear that his psychological architecture was as methodical as his physical operations. Keyes was a man who systematized human behavior, reduced morality to abstract irrelevance, and treated life and death as elements of a controlled experiment. His thought patterns were not impulsive. They were a deliberate calculus, designed to exploit opportunity minimize risk, and maximize control. Understanding this psychological framework is essential to comprehending how he could operate undetected for over a decade. Keyes exhibited traits characteristic of organized psychopathy, yet he also transcended typical definitions in important ways. He possessed a high level of cognitive functioning, self-discipline, and foresight. Unlike impulsive psychopaths who leave chaotic trails, Keyes meticulously planned each murder, considering every variable from victim selection to escape routes. He demonstrated a rare combination of analytical intelligence, social manipulation, and operational discipline. He could integrate environmental factors, human behavior, and logistical considerations into a single coherent strategy, a trait that made him exceptionally dangerous. Central to his psychology was a profound detachment from empathy and remorse. Keyes did not kill out of rage, sexual compulsion, or revenge. For him, murder was not emotional. It was a demonstration of control and mastery. In interviews following his arrest, he described his killings in terms of operational success, detailing how he executed each step without moral reflection. This level of detachment allowed him to remain calm in situations that would terrify or overwhelm most individuals, contributing to his ability to act decisively and invisibly. Keyes' sense of morality was utilitarian and instrumental. He did not adhere to conventional social ethics. His moral compass was internal, guided by principles of efficiency and invisibility rather than justice or compassion. Victims were objects, opportunities for control rather than people with intrinsic value. This perception allowed him to navigate society without emotional distraction, maintaining outward normalcy while committing acts that violated the deepest societal taboos. His understanding of human behavior was sophisticated. Keyes could read subtle cues in speech, posture, and expression, allowing him to identify fear, compliance, or hesitation. He manipulated these behaviors to create opportunities for abduction and control. In many cases, victims were unwitting participants in their own demise, guided by his social engineering skills. This psychological acuity was reinforced by years of observation, self-study, and trial in low-risk scenarios before escalating to murder. Patience was not merely a behavioral trait, it was a strategic weapon. Keyes often waited months or years between murders, rehearsing scenarios mentally, studying potential locations, and monitoring responses from previous incidents. He viewed time as a tool, exploiting natural decay and evidence, fading human memory, and the compartmentalization of law enforcement jurisdiction. In this sense, his patience was both a psychological strength and an operational advantage, ensuring that each act of violence was executed under optimal conditions. Keyes also exhibited cognitive compartmentalization at an extreme level. He was able to maintain multiple identities simultaneously: the caring father, the responsible contractor, the neighbor, and the invisible predator. These roles never intersected, allowing him to operate seamlessly in society while engaging in acts of extreme violence. This duality was not merely concealment. It was integrated into his self-concept, enabling him to reconcile outward morality with inner amorality. Another notable psychological trait was his intellectualization of violence. He treated murder as an engineering problem: planning, logistics, risk mitigation, and execution. There was no theatricality, no need for recognition, and no emotional gratification beyond the satisfaction of control. Unlike other killers who rely on trophies, signatures, or media attention, Keyes' reward system was private, internal, and abstract. This allowed him to maintain operational security and remain undetected for years. Keyes' self-perception was also influenced by a sense of superiority. He saw himself as a strategist, someone who could navigate human systems and exploit vulnerabilities that others could not. This sense of intellectual mastery reinforced his detachment and justified his actions within his own framework. He was not merely a criminal. In his own mind, he was an operative executing a carefully designed series of controlled operations, a predator with skill, foresight, and precision. Even his interactions with law enforcement post-capture reflected this mindset. Keyes approached interrogation analytically, describing crimes in a matter-of-fact, operational tone. He was not seeking empathy or absolution. He was explaining processes, timelines, and logistics. His ability to describe murder in terms of engineering and control rather than emotion underscores the depth of his detachment and his commitment to a systematic approach to predation. Keyes' dark psychology reveals a chilling combination of traits: strategic intelligence, emotional detachment, patience, meticulous planning, and acute observational skills. These traits, combined with his nomadic lifestyle and operational tools, created a predator capable of sustained, invisible predation over more than a decade. Understanding his mind provides insight not only into his crimes, but also into how individuals can exploit societal, technological, and psychological systems to commit acts of extreme violence undetected. The study of Keyes' psychology is a sobering reminder that not all threats are impulsive or visible. Some operate in quiet, methodical ways, leveraging patience, observation, and control to achieve outcomes that defy conventional expectations. Keyes exemplified this modern, calculated approach to serial killing, blending intellect, detachment, and operational mastery into a uniquely chilling and effective predatory model. Chapter 9. The Victims, Lives Taken Across the Nation. Israel Keyes' nomadic killing spree left a shadow of devastation across the United States, touching communities far from his Alaskan home and leaving investigators struggling to connect disparate cases. Unlike many serial killers who focus on a specific demographic or geographic area, Keyes' victims were chosen with a deliberate randomness that made pattern recognition difficult. They were men and women, young and old, each abducted and murdered with methodical precision, their lives reduced to variables in a deadly equation. Understanding these victims is crucial, not only to grasp the scale of his crimes, but to humanize those whose existence was erased in ways both horrifying and meticulous. From the early 2000s onwards, Keyes' victims spanned multiple states. One hallmark of his predation was the lack of a consistent profile. He did not target a single type of person, nor did he focus on individuals he knew. Instead, he sought vulnerability and opportunity. Often, victims were unsuspecting individuals in public spaces, approached by a man who appeared ordinary, trustworthy, or helpful. He relied on charm and subtle social engineering to lower defenses, allowing him to abduct individuals without confrontation. Many victims were strangers in remote areas, reflecting Keyes' preference for control and isolation. He often lured them to locations pre-selected for privacy and concealment: rural areas, abandoned buildings, or sites near pre-buried kill kits. Once isolated, Keyes executed his plan with clinical detachment. Unlike other killers who rely on violent outbursts or impulsive behavior, Keyes' abductions were calm, calculated, and controlled. The environment, the timing, and the psychological manipulation were all tools to ensure minimal resistance and maximum efficiency. The emotional impact on families and communities was profound, yet often delayed in recognition. Because Keyes' murders were scattered geographically and temporally, the connections between disappearances were rarely immediate. Families were left in confusion, law enforcement struggled with jurisdictional challenges, and communities experienced the disorienting trauma of sudden, unexplained loss. Keyes' randomness was a psychological weapon that extended beyond his victims. He destabilized networks of care and trust, leaving ripples of fear and grief that persisted for years. One of the earliest known victims occurred in the early 2000s in a rural Alaskan setting. This murder, while geographically close to Keyes' home, was executed with the same operational rigor that would define his later crimes. Victim selection based on opportunity, meticulous planning, and careful concealment of evidence. Keyes' methods ensured that the disappearance initially seemed like a local anomaly, unconnected to any broader threat. This early case exemplifies his ability to operate quietly, leaving devastation without raising suspicion. As Keyes' killings expanded across the nation, he continued to rely on premeditation and invisibility. In each case, he selected victims whose routines, locations, and behaviors could be manipulated for easy abduction. He avoided patterns that law enforcement might detect, deliberately varying the age, gender, and circumstances of victims. Some victims were taken from urban environments, others from rural or recreational areas. The geographic diversity of his victims contributed to the difficulty in linking cases and underscores the chilling adaptability of his predatory methods. Keyes' victims were often unaware of their impending danger until it was too late. He studied human behavior to exploit subtle vulnerabilities, distraction, routine, or trust in social norms. Many of his abductions began as seemingly benign interactions, a request for assistance, a casual conversation, or an offer of help. Keyes' ability to blend into society, to appear normal while planning abduction, was critical. The trust or neutrality of his demeanor disarmed potential victims, allowing him to exercise control without physical confrontation. The psychological impact on survivors, witnesses, and those indirectly affected was also significant. Keyes' ability to move silently and unpredictably created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Families could not predict risk. Law enforcement could not identify patterns. This uncertainty amplified fear, disrupting communities and creating a sense of vulnerability that extended beyond the immediate circle of victims. Keyes' crimes were not only acts of murder, but also instruments of widespread psychological disruption. While the full extent of his victims remains unknown, investigators have been able to confirm several murders and attribute others based on Keyes' own admissions following his arrest. His willingness to recount certain details revealed the depth of his operations. Years of preparation, precise execution, and extreme attention to minimizing exposure. These accounts provided critical insight into both his methods and the human toll of his crimes. Each confirmed victim represents a life carefully chosen, methodically taken, and meticulously erased from the world. The randomness of Keyes' victim selection also highlights the unique danger he posed. Unlike killers who can be profiled based on location, behavior, or demographics, Keyes' unpredictability made him almost impossible to anticipate. Every interaction with the public carried latent risk, yet there was no discernible pattern to warn communities or authorities. This randomness was both a hallmark of his operational sophistication and a reflection of his abstract, calculating approach to predation. Keyes' approach to murder, detached, methodical, and geographically diverse, demonstrates a terrifying efficiency. Victims were often stripped of their ability to resist, and the aftermath of their deaths left minimal traces. Communities remained unaware for months, sometimes years, and connections between cases were obscured by distance and time. Each act reinforced Keyes' belief in his own mastery, and each disappearance served as a testament to his ability to operate as a ghost moving through society. As Israel Keyes' nomadic killings progressed, the human toll became increasingly apparent. Each victim represented a life disrupted, a family left in confusion, and a community haunted by uncertainty. Yet, the true scale of his predation remained hidden for years, obscured by his randomness, mobility, and meticulous operational security. Unlike other killers whose actions leave predictable patterns, Keyes' victims were scattered across states, demographics, and circumstances, making it nearly impossible to connect the dots until after his capture. Keyes' approach to victim selection during this period reinforced his strategic thinking. He actively avoided individuals connected to his personal life, acquaintances, or any environment where he might be recognized. Instead, he sought vulnerability and opportunity, frequently targeting those in isolated or transitional situations, travelers at airports, vacationers in rental properties, or individuals in rural areas. This allowed him to operate with minimal risk of identification, while his pre-planned kill kits ensured that he had everything required to execute the abduction and murder efficiently. One of the most chilling aspects of Keyes' crimes was his use of geographical randomness as a psychological weapon. Victims were not taken from a single community, town, or region. Instead, Keyes traveled extensively, exploiting the gaps in law enforcement communication between jurisdictions. A disappearance in one state might be entirely unrelated in the eyes of local authorities to another in a different state, even if the same perpetrator was responsible. This geographic separation not only aided Keyes' concealment, but also intensified the emotional confusion for families, who often found no explanation for their loved one's sudden disappearance. Despite the randomness, patterns emerge when examining his methodology. Keyes often abducted victims during moments when they were alone or minimally supervised, when normal social routines left them vulnerable. He relied on his ability to read human behavior, noting subtle cues in posture, attentiveness, and responses to conversation. Keyes' social acumen allowed him to exploit trust in ordinary interactions. People naturally respond to politeness, helpfulness, or seemingly ordinary requests. In these moments, he transformed benign social exchanges into lethal encounters. The psychological aftermath for families and communities was profound. Many families initially believed their loved one had left voluntarily or disappeared due to accident. Law enforcement struggled to reconcile the randomness of the disappearances, leaving families in a prolonged state of uncertainty and distress. For Keyes, this extended sense of disruption reinforced the impact of his actions. His victims were not only removed from society, but the communities around them were destabilized by the unpredictability and invisibility of his presence. Confirmed victims from this period illustrate the breadth of his operations. Some were taken from urban environments where anonymity was easier to exploit. Others were isolated in rural or wilderness settings, where concealment and preparation maximized the likelihood of complete operational success. Each abduction was marked by careful psychological manipulation, strategic timing, and meticulous attention to detail. The consistency lay not in the victim type, location, or method, but in the underlying precision and forethought that characterized every crime. Keyes' methodology also minimized the chance of post-mortem discovery. His pre-buried kill kits and selection of remote locations reduced the likelihood that remains would be found quickly, if at all. Even when remains were eventually discovered, the connections to Keyes were not immediately apparent. This allowed him to operate over a long period without law enforcement being able to link multiple murders, further reinforcing the perception of randomness and enhancing his anonymity. The sheer diversity of his victims underscores the challenge he posed to profiling and investigative techniques. He did not conform to the typical patterns law enforcement relied upon. No consistent demographic, geographic, or behavioral profile emerged. This randomness was a deliberate tactic, making him virtually invisible to systems designed to detect serial offending. Each victim represented not just a life taken, but an intricate part of a broader strategy of invisibility, showing a predator who had thought far beyond the standard assumptions about serial crime. The victim stories, although scattered and sometimes fragmented, reveal the human consequences of KEYES' actions. Each life lost had personal, emotional, and societal reverberations. Families were left grieving without understanding. Communities were left wary and unsettled. Yet KEYES' detachment ensured that the impact on him was non-existent. In his mind, these were variables in a controlled system, removed from moral or emotional consideration. This psychological separation from the human consequences of his actions allowed him to continue his crimes with clinical precision. Ultimately, the victims of Israel KEYES are a reminder of the silent, methodical nature of his predation. Their diversity, geographic spread, and the careful erasure of their presence illustrate the effectiveness of his operational philosophy: patience, preparation, invisibility, and psychological mastery. While law enforcement struggled to connect the dots, KEYES continued to operate, leaving communities devastated yet unaware of the full scope of the threat. His victims were not merely statistics. They were lives meticulously targeted, strategically removed, and cruelly anonymized, demonstrating the terrifying efficacy of a truly modern nomadic killer. Chapter 10: Investigation and Capture. The Fall of a Ghost. Israel KEYES' meticulously constructed world of anonymity, control, and invisibility began to unravel in 2012, culminating in a sequence of events that brought one of the most elusive modern serial killers to justice. For over a decade, KEYES had operated across the United States, moving silently, striking unpredictably, and leaving law enforcement frustrated by the absence of patterns, signatures, or geographic consistency. His eventual capture, however, was less the result of forensic brilliance and more a convergence of circumstance, routine, and human error, a reminder that even the most methodical predators can be undone by the smallest oversight. The critical turning point began with the disappearance of Samantha Koenig, an 18-year-old barista in Anchorage, Alaska. On February 2, 2012, Koenig finished her shift at a coffee stand and vanished. Her disappearance was initially treated as a local missing person case, with authorities following standard protocols, canvassing witnesses, reviewing surveillance footage, and tracing contacts. However, Koenig's disappearance soon revealed patterns that hinted at a deeper, more calculated threat, despite the apparent randomness. This case would ultimately become the thread that led to KEYES' undoing. KEYES had carefully orchestrated Koenig's abduction. Utilizing his skills in psychological manipulation, he approached her under the guise of a friendly interaction, leveraging her trust and his unremarkable appearance to gain compliance. His planning included prior surveillance, knowledge of escape routes, and access to preposition tools that allowed him to commit the crime without leaving immediately visible evidence. To KEYES, Koenig was another variable in a controlled experiment. Her disappearance was both a crime and an extension of the operational philosophy he had honed over years. Unlike his prior victims, however, KEYES made the critical misstep of leaving a trace in the digital world. Investigators reviewing security footage from the coffee stand identified a suspicious individual whose actions and behavior warranted further scrutiny. While KEYES was careful to avoid obvious digital footprints, the combination of modern surveillance technology and the situational exposure of a public, monitored location created a window that law enforcement could exploit. In KEYES' meticulously controlled universe, this exposure represented an anomaly he had not anticipated, a slight disruption that would cascade into his eventual capture. Anchorage police began connecting dots with the precision of methodical investigation, but the identification of KEYES as a suspect was still challenging. At this stage, his name was not yet widely known to law enforcement as a potential serial offender. Investigators relied on witness descriptions, transaction records, and digital evidence from surveillance footage. This case required piecing together disparate elements: behavioral observation, minor inconsistencies, and subtle cues that hinted at a larger, more dangerous presence operating across Alaska and potentially beyond. That KEYES' interactions with law enforcement were, in the early stages, deceptively calm. When approached, he maintained an appearance of normalcy, reinforcing his ordinary persona. This calmness mirrored his approach to victims: control without overt aggression, observation without exposure. Investigators quickly noted his demeanor as unusual for someone under suspicion, a combination of disarming friendliness and intellectual composure that masked the predator beneath. KEYES' psychological mastery, which had aided him in abductions and murders, now functioned as a tool to buy time and deflect suspicion. The breakthrough came when forensic analysis and digital tracing began to align with witness accounts. Authorities could confirm KEYES' presence near the coffee stand and identify connections to vehicles and locations previously unknown. Unlike many serial killers whose apprehension relies heavily on post-mortem evidence or tips from the public, KEYES' downfall was rooted in meticulous observation and the exploitation of minor exposure points he could not completely control. Even the most disciplined operative leaves traces. In KEYES' case, it was a combination of technology, circumstance, and procedural diligence that created the opening. As investigators closed in, KEYES remained methodical in his own internal calculations. He understood the stakes, recognized the procedural methods likely to be employed, and attempted to maintain composure. This situational awareness, while consistent with his prior behavior, ultimately could not overcome the accumulation of evidence converging on him. Each minor anomaly, security footage, digital transactions, witness memory, coalesced into a net that KEYES could not escape. The Koenig case exemplifies both the brilliance and vulnerability inherent in KEYES' methodology. For years, he had operated with near-total impunity, relying on geographic randomness, psychological manipulation, pre-buried kill kits, and patience to remain undetected. Yet, in a public setting under the watchful eye of surveillance and law enforcement procedure, a small miscalculation, a routine choice by a victim, or an unavoidable exposure in the physical environment proved sufficient to crack the armor of invisibility. In the days following Koenig's disappearance, law enforcement intensified their investigation, tracking leads, conducting interviews, and reviewing surveillance footage across Anchorage. Each discovery reinforced the understanding that they were dealing with a methodical, intelligent, and highly dangerous individual. The urgency was heightened by KEYES' established pattern. Patience and mobility meant that, unless apprehended, he could vanish again, leaving another victim in his wake. This phase of the investigation highlights a paradox central to modern predation. Even killers who leverage patience, preparation, and invisibility are vulnerable to the convergence of human observation and technology. While KEYES' operational security had allowed him to evade detection for years, the combination of a monitored public space, witness memory, and digital surveillance created the conditions for his capture. It underscores the evolving relationship between criminal strategy and investigative adaptation in the digital age. Following the disappearance of Samantha Koenig, The investigation rapidly intensified, and the focus narrowed on Israel Keyes as the primary suspect. Unlike other serial killers who might be captured due to repeated errors, Keyes' undoing was the result of a combination of careful investigative work, forensic technology, and the rare, unavoidable exposure that even the most meticulous predator cannot fully control. As authorities honed in on his identity, the intricate web of his crimes began to unravel, revealing a scale and methodical sophistication that had previously gone undetected. Keyes was arrested on March 13, 2012, in a dramatic and swift operation in Anchorage. His capture was the culmination of a chain of evidence stemming from Koenig's disappearance, including witness testimony, surveillance footage, and vehicle tracking. From the moment of apprehension, law enforcement recognized that they were dealing with an offender unlike typical serial killers. Keyes was intelligent, controlled, and dangerously methodical, capable of long-term planning and cross-jurisdictional crime. Unlike impulsive predators, his behavior during the arrest was calm and composed, displaying the same psychological detachment that had characterized his interactions with victims. Once in custody, Keyes' interrogation revealed the horrifying breadth of his criminal activities. Unlike many offenders who initially deny involvement, Keyes provided detailed accounts of his murders, describing the locations, logistics, and premeditated methods with chilling clarity. He admitted to planning and executing multiple murders across the United States, often years apart, using pre-buried kill kits and exploiting the vulnerabilities of victims. Investigators were confronted with the realization that Keyes' crimes were far more extensive than previously understood, spanning time, geography, and demographics. That Keyes' confessions revealed several key elements of his operational philosophy. First, his crimes were never impulsive. Each act was calculated, deliberate, and executed with careful attention to minimizing risk. Second, he used geographical separation to prevent detection. Murders were committed far from his home, across different states, and often with years between them. This tactic exploited jurisdictional gaps and the limitations of law enforcement communication, leaving authorities unable to connect his crimes until his confession. Third, he relied on psychological manipulation and social observation to abduct victims with minimal resistance. Keyes' precision and patience transformed each act into a near-perfect operational execution. The revelations shocked investigators and the public alike. Keyes' methodical approach meant that many of his victims remained unidentified for months or years, and the scope of his predation challenged conventional profiling techniques. Law enforcement agencies began to coordinate more extensively, analyzing patterns of disappearances, geographic mobility, and operational methods that Keyes had described. His confessions provided a unique insight into a mind that combined intelligence, patience, and strategic planning in ways rarely seen in criminal history. One particularly chilling aspect of the investigation was Keyes' ability to recall and describe kill kit locations and preparation methods in detail. He admitted to burying weapons, tools, and materials in remote areas, which he would later use to commit murders without reliance on local resources. These admissions not only confirmed his operational methods, but also highlighted the extreme foresight and planning that allowed him to operate undetected for years. The discovery of these caches validated his confessions and offered investigators concrete evidence of his meticulous preparation. Keyes' demeanor during interrogations remained remarkably calm, almost clinical. He spoke of murders as tasks, describing each step in terms of logistics, timing, and control. There was no remorse, no emotional expression of guilt, and no need for sensationalism. This composure further underscored his psychopathic detachment and operational discipline. Investigators were confronted not only with the scale of his crimes, but also with the depth of his psychological separation from the humanity of his victims. The capture and interrogation of Keyes also shed light on the limitations of law enforcement prior to his apprehension. His use of mobility, anonymity, and preposition tools allowed him to exploit gaps in jurisdictional coordination and investigative patterns. Cases that had previously appeared as isolated disappearances or accidents were now connected, revealing the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed Keyes to operate across state lines for over a decade. His case became a pivotal study in understanding the intersection of operational sophistication, psychological detachment, and investigative challenges in modern criminal justice. While Keyes provided confessions and information about several murders, the full scope of his crimes may never be completely known. His meticulous operational security, geographic randomness, and deliberate delays between murders left few forensic traces, and some victims may never be identified. Nevertheless, his capture marked the end of a terrifying chapter in American criminal history. The fall of a ghost who had eluded authorities for years, leaving devastation in his wake. The arrest of Israel Keyes serves as a stark reminder that even the most careful and disciplined predators can be undone by small miscalculations, technological oversight, and relentless investigative work. It also highlights the evolving challenges law enforcement faces in an era of mobility, digital tracking, and fragmented jurisdictional authority. Keyes' case is studied not only for its criminal horror, but also for the lessons it provides in detection, prevention, and understanding the psychology of extreme predation. Chapter 11: Confessions and Interrogations. Revelations of a Serial Killer. Following his arrest in 2012, Israel Keyes became a window into a mind that had operated in near total secrecy for over a decade. Law enforcement faced the daunting task of piecing together years of crimes, spanning multiple states, victims, and methods, from the carefully controlled narratives Keyes began to reveal. Unlike many serial killers who provide limited or misleading information, Keyes was unusually forthcoming in some respects, detailing his operations with a calm, almost clinical demeanor that revealed both his meticulous nature and profound psychological detachment. The confessions began slowly. Initially, Keyes provided information regarding Samantha Koenig's abduction and murder, offering precise details that only the perpetrator could know. His recollections were not colored by emotion or remorse. Instead, he spoke in operational terms, describing the logistics of the abduction, his premeditation, and the steps he had taken to avoid detection. Investigators quickly realized that they were dealing with a man who had applied the same systematic approach to confessing as he had to killing: methodical, detailed, and precise. Keyes' willingness to discuss his crimes provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a modern nomadic killer. He explained how he selected victims, often choosing individuals who were vulnerable but not connected to him personally, minimizing risk of recognition or attachment. He detailed the process of surveillance, manipulation, and careful timing, demonstrating a level of strategic planning that had previously confounded investigators. Each confession illuminated his philosophy. Murder was not impulsive, violent expression, or a search for gratification, but a calculated exercise in control and mastery. During these interrogations, Keyes revealed his use of pre-buried kill kits as integral to his operations. He described how he had stashed weapons, restraints, and tools in remote locations across the country, sometimes months or even years in advance. These caches allowed him to strike opportunistically while minimizing the risk of detection, as he rarely needed to carry incriminating materials with him. This level of foresight, combined with patience and geographical randomness, exemplified his ability to manipulate both physical and social environments in service of his crimes. Investigators were also struck by Keyes' precision in recounting his movements, often providing detailed timelines that tracked his interactions, travel, and logistical planning. His ability to recall minute details, from specific locations to the precise sequence of actions, reflected both his intelligence and his obsessive operational discipline. Unlike killers who rely on memory gaps or intentionally obscure details, Keyes' confessions were coherent and internally consistent, offering investigators a rare opportunity to map his crimes in chronological and geographical context. That a significant aspect of these confessions was Keyes' psychological transparency. He openly described his motivations, detachment, and internal reward system. Unlike killers driven by emotion, sex, or anger, Keyes' satisfaction stemmed from the successful execution of his plan, the maintenance of anonymity, and the exertion of control over his victims. He did not collect trophies, leave signatures, or seek recognition. For Keyes, the act itself was an end in itself, a controlled, meticulously orchestrated exercise in dominance and invisibility. Keyes also provided information about his victim selection criteria, revealing an unsettling logic. He sought individuals who were accessible, minimally likely to resist, and strategically isolated. His victims ranged in age, gender, and circumstance, reflecting his deliberate avoidance of predictable patterns that could be detected by law enforcement. This randomness, he explained, was a conscious strategy to reduce the likelihood of connections being made between his crimes, allowing him to operate across states without establishing detectable links. One of the most harrowing elements of the confessions was the way Keyes described managing risk and contingency. He meticulously planned abductions, escape routes, and disposal strategies to ensure that no evidence could be traced back to him. He spoke of adjusting plans dynamically, observing human behavior to anticipate resistance, and selecting locations that maximized concealment. This operational mindset transformed each murder into a strategic exercise rather than a crime driven by emotion or compulsion. That Keyes' cooperation in interrogation also revealed the challenges investigators faced in reconstructing his activities. Many of his admissions referred to crimes that spanned multiple jurisdictions, often with years separating incidents. Linking cases across states required careful coordination, analysis of travel records, missing persons reports, and his detailed accounts. His confessions served as a map, illuminating the vast scope of his predation while highlighting the limitations of law enforcement systems in tracking a mobile, methodical killer operating outside conventional patterns. Despite the chilling nature of his disclosures, Keyes displayed remarkable composure throughout. There was no outward remorse, no dramatization, and no attempts to manipulate investigators through false narratives. His confessions were delivered with the same calm detachment that characterized his interactions with victims, reflecting a profound compartmentalization of morality and emotion. In many ways, his demeanor underscored the intellectualized nature of his crimes. Every action, whether committed or confessed, was part of a controlled, deliberate process. The early interrogations laid the foundation for understanding Keyes' operational philosophy. Investigators began to comprehend the scale, sophistication, and psychological mechanisms behind his crimes. Patience as a weapon, randomness as protection, premeditation as a shield, and detachment as both tool and identity. Keyes' willingness to articulate these elements provided a rare glimpse into the workings of a predator who had remained invisible for over a decade, leaving an indelible mark on the landscape of modern serial crime. As interrogations continued, Israel Keyes' confessions began to reveal a level of operational sophistication and psychological detachment that astonished investigators. What had initially appeared to be a single high-profile crime, the abduction and murder of Samantha Koenig, unfolded into a sprawling network of murders, each executed with meticulous planning, patience, and a chilling lack of empathy. Keyes' detailed accounts offered an unprecedented window into the mind of a nomadic killer who had remained invisible for over a decade. One of the most striking revelations was Keyes' deliberate use of geographical mobility as a tool of concealment. He explained how he traveled extensively across the United States, committing murders far from familiar environments, often in states where he had no connections or routine. This randomness made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to detect patterns or link cases across jurisdictions. By varying the locations and timing of his crimes, Keyes ensured that traditional investigative techniques, such as profiling by geographic proximity, were largely ineffective against him. Keyes also described his meticulous approach to victim selection, highlighting the balance of opportunity, vulnerability, and risk minimization. Victims were often strangers with predictable routines or those in transitional or isolated situations. He leveraged subtle psychological manipulation to gain compliance, demonstrating an acute understanding of human behavior. These methods allowed him to abduct victims without confrontation, relying on social engineering rather than brute force. Each selection was calculated, designed to minimize exposure and maximize control. During interrogation, Keyes provided details of kill kit preparation and execution that revealed his premeditative genius. He had stashed weapons, restraints, and tools in remote locations across multiple states, sometimes years in advance. This foresight allowed him to commit murders opportunistically without the burden of transporting incriminating materials, reducing the risk of detection. Keyes explained the redundancy built into his caches, multiple methods of restraint, alternative weapons, and escape contingencies. These measures reflected a level of strategic thinking akin to military planning rather than criminal improvisation. Perhaps most disturbing was Keyes' discussion of the psychological gratification derived from his crimes. Unlike many serial killers motivated by sexual compulsion, anger, or attention-seeking, Keyes' satisfaction was rooted in the successful completion of his plan and the maintenance of anonymity. He took no trophies, left no signatures, and did not seek media recognition. The act of controlling the circumstances of life and death, coupled with his ability to vanish afterward, was his reward. This internalized gratification contributed to his operational security, as there were no overt behavioral patterns for investigators to exploit. Keyes' confessions also illustrated his patience as a tactical tool. He often waited months or even years before striking, observing victims and planning logistics to ensure minimal risk. This temporal detachment allowed him to manipulate circumstances to his advantage, exploiting natural decay in evidence and the fading of witnesses' memories. Patience, in Keyes' mind, was not a personal virtue but an operational necessity, enabling him to maintain invisibility while executing a deadly plan. Investigators also learned of Keyes' strategic thinking about law enforcement and investigative procedures. He had studied media coverage of missing persons cases and law enforcement protocols, understanding the typical investigative trajectories. He intentionally avoided behaviors that could trigger attention, such as repeated local visits, identifiable patterns in travel, or interactions with victims known to authorities. This strategic anticipation of detection reinforced his ability to remain a ghost in plain sight, undetectable even as he moved freely across the country. The confessions further revealed Keyes' extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization. He maintained a facade of normalcy, appearing as a responsible father, a neighbor, and a small business owner, while simultaneously engaging in acts of extreme violence. This dual existence required an almost surgical separation of identities, allowing him to navigate everyday life without arousing suspicion. The cognitive ability to maintain such compartmentalization for years underscores both his intelligence and his psychopathic detachment. Keyes' revelations forced investigators to reassess previous unsolved cases. Murders and disappearances that had initially seemed isolated were reconsidered in light of his admissions. His confessions provided timelines, geographic markers, and operational details that allowed law enforcement to reconstruct events that had remained mysterious for years. Each new disclosure expanded the known scope of his crimes, transforming him from a local suspect into a confirmed, cross-country predator whose impact was vast and multifaceted. Despite the horrific content of his confessions, Keyes' demeanor remained remarkably composed. There was no overt remorse, no desire to dramatize, and no attempt to manipulate investigators emotionally. His recounting of murders was methodical, almost clinical, reflecting the same operational detachment he applied to committing the crimes themselves. This calm, analytical presentation further underscored the psychological chasm between Keyes and ordinary human morality, offering investigators a glimpse into the inner workings of a uniquely calculating mind. The culmination of these confessions was the realization that Keyes had redefined the parameters of modern serial crime. He combined mobility, operational precision, psychological manipulation, and strategic foresight in ways that challenged law enforcement norms and investigative assumptions. The confessions did not merely provide details of past crimes. They exposed a systematic methodology, a philosophy of predation, and an intellectualized approach to murder that was both terrifying and instructive. Chapter 12. The Trial and Public Reaction. Facing the Nomadic Killer, the arrest of Israel Keyes in 2012 sent shockwaves through Alaska and the broader United States. Law enforcement officials, previously grappling with a series of unexplained disappearances, suddenly had a suspect who not only confessed to multiple murders, but also demonstrated an unprecedented level of planning, patience, and psychological detachment. The revelations about Keyes' nomadic killing spree created a media frenzy, while communities struggled to comprehend the randomness, sophistication, and scale of his crimes. As the legal process began, both the public and the judicial system faced the complex task of confronting a criminal whose methodology defied conventional understanding. From the outset, the trial posed unique challenges. Keyes' confessions were detailed and methodical, yet the psychological distance with which he recounted his crimes complicated the process of presenting evidence in court. Prosecutors were tasked not only with proving his involvement in specific murders, but also with conveying to jurors the full scope of his predatory capabilities and the terrifying precision with which he operated. Unlike trials centered on impulsive or emotionally driven offenders, Keyes' case required the court to grapple with a calculated, almost intellectualized form of violence, challenging traditional notions of criminal motive and behavior. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Media coverage highlighted both the randomness of Keyes' victim selection and the sophisticated planning behind his crimes. Communities across the nation realized that disappearances once considered isolated or unrelated could have been the work of the same predator. The nomadic nature of Keyes' crimes magnified public fear, illustrating how a single individual, unbound by geographic constraints, could infiltrate multiple communities, execute murders, and vanish without trace. This sense of unpredictability amplified societal anxiety, emphasizing the rare combination of intellect, patience, and malice embodied in Keyes. The trial also brought to light the limitations of law enforcement coordination prior to Keyes' arrest. His geographic mobility and reliance on pre-buried kill kits exploited gaps in communication between jurisdictions, revealing systemic vulnerabilities in investigating serial predation that span state lines. In this sense, the trial became more than a legal proceeding. It was a case study in the challenges of modern criminal investigation, highlighting the intersection of mobility, technology, and psychological sophistication in contemporary crime. Keyes' demeanor during pretrial proceedings reinforced the unsettling portrait painted by his confessions. He remained calm, composed, and detached, showing no visible remorse or agitation. His interactions with attorneys, court personnel, and the public maintained the same controlled, measured behavior that had allowed him to evade detection for years. This composure, while unnerving, further underscored the intellectualized and operationalized nature of his crimes. It became clear that Keyes' persona was not fractured by guilt or anxiety. Rather, it was a consistent extension of his meticulously maintained psychological and operational identity. For prosecutors, presenting the case required careful balancing of factual evidence and psychological context. Surveillance footage, travel records, forensic evidence, and Keyes' own admissions formed the backbone of the prosecution, while expert testimony helped jurors understand the unusual traits that characterized his behavior. These experts explained his methodical planning, use of geographic randomness, psychological manipulation, and extreme patience, factors that collectively created the conditions for undetected predation. This approach allowed the court to grasp not just individual crimes, but the overarching methodology that defined Keyes' criminal career. The societal implications of Keyes' case were profound. Families of victims, previously left with unanswered questions, faced the harrowing reality that their loved ones had been part of a broader, premeditated pattern of murder. Communities reevaluated safety protocols, particularly in public spaces and among vulnerable populations. The media, law enforcement, and public discourse began to explore the psychological profile of a nomadic, highly intelligent serial killer, raising awareness of a form of predation that differed markedly from traditional, localized serial crimes. That Keyes' trial also highlighted the tension between procedural justice and the emotional gravity of his crimes. Jurors were confronted with the horrifying randomness and scale of his predation, while attorneys had to maintain focus on individual charges and evidentiary standards. This tension underscored a unique aspect of Keyes' criminality. His crimes were as much a psychological assault on society as they were physical assaults on individual victims. The courtroom became a space where both the legal system and public consciousness grappled with the implications of a killer who had operated with remarkable intelligence, patience, and invisibility. In summary, the early stages of the trial illuminated the extraordinary challenges posed by Israel Keyes. His confessions, operational methodology, and psychological detachment created a complex case that tested the limits of law, investigative coordination, and public understanding. The trial was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a confrontation with a predator who had redefined the parameters of serial crime in the modern era, demonstrating the terrifying efficacy of a mind unbound by conventional morality, geography, or emotional compulsion. As Israel Keyes' trial progressed, the focus intensified on the shocking scope and methodology of his crimes. The courtroom became a stage not only for legal proceedings, but for society to confront the reality of a nomadic serial killer whose intelligence, patience, and meticulous planning had allowed him to operate undetected for over a decade. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, and each confession highlighted a predator who defied conventional profiles, challenging both law enforcement and public understanding of modern serial predation. That a key element of the proceedings was the presentation of Keyes' confessions, which detailed not only the acts themselves, but the elaborate planning that preceded them. He described the pre-burial of weapons and restraints in remote locations, careful surveillance of potential victims, and the precise timing of abductions. Unlike impulsive offenders, Keyes treated each murder as a carefully orchestrated operation. Prosecutors emphasized this methodical approach, arguing that it reflected deliberate, premeditated intent rather than any form of emotional or opportunistic violence. This helped jurors understand the unique danger Keyes posed. A killer who treated murder as a strategic exercise rather than a compulsion. The reaction of the public was visceral. Media coverage amplified the extraordinary nature of Keyes' predation, describing him as a ghost who had infiltrated multiple states, struck at random, and vanished without trace. Communities that had once considered disappearances isolated and unrelated now realized that they could have been the work of the same individual. The randomness of his victims, men, women, young, and old, combined with his nomadic habits, created a sense of pervasive uncertainty. Parents, travelers, and ordinary citizens began to comprehend the terrifying possibility that someone like Keyes could operate unnoticed in their midst. During the trial, forensic experts provided critical insight into Keyes' methodology. They explained how his pre-buried kill kits functioned, how geographic randomness obscured patterns of predation, and how his psychological manipulation enabled him to abduct victims without confrontation. These explanations were vital in helping the jury understand not just the what of the crimes, but the how and why. The extraordinary operational discipline and psychological detachment that characterized Keyes' approach. The presentation of this evidence reinforced the view that Keyes was not a typical serial killer, but a highly organized, strategically minded predator. Families of victims were confronted with both relief and horror. On one hand, Keyes' confessions and trial proceedings provided long-sought answers, connecting disappearances and deaths that had remained mysterious for years. On the other hand, the scale, randomness, and deliberate planning of his crimes magnified the emotional trauma. Testimonies and courtroom accounts humanized the victims, offering glimpses into their lives while underscoring the cruel efficiency with which Keyes had ended them. The juxtaposition of personal grief and operational analysis created a complex emotional landscape within the courtroom and the public consciousness. Public discourse during this time also highlighted broader societal concerns. Keyes' mobility and operational sophistication exposed vulnerabilities in law enforcement coordination across states and jurisdictions. The trial sparked conversations about communication gaps, investigative limitations, and the challenges of tracking highly mobile offenders in an era of widespread travel and technological anonymity. Experts emphasized that Keyes' ability to remain undetected for years was as much a function of systemic gaps as it was of his personal cunning, prompting debates about reform, interagency cooperation, and the evolving nature of criminal strategy. Throughout the trial, Keyes maintained his characteristic composure. Unlike many defendants who display anxiety, anger, or attempts at manipulation, Keyes remained calm, detached, and precise. His courtroom demeanor mirrored the operational detachment he exhibited with victims, emphasizing that for him, control and calculation were paramount. This calmness further unnerved observers and highlighted the profound psychological separation between Keyes and conventional moral frameworks. reinforcing the notion that he had approached murder as an intellectual exercise rather than an emotional act. The trial also served as a lens through which the public could examine the concept of randomness in criminal behavior. Keyes deliberately avoided predictable patterns, targeting victims with no apparent connection to him and varying locations to reduce detection risk. This strategy, central to his success, forced society to reconsider assumptions about serial crime, that patterns, victim profiles, or geographic proximity are reliable indicators of danger. Keyes' approach demonstrated that modern predators can exploit gaps in human perception and systemic limitations to commit crimes without leaving overt patterns. Ultimately, the trial of Israel Keyes was both a legal proceeding and a profound societal confrontation with a new paradigm of serial predation. It exposed the devastating combination of intelligence, patience, mobility, and psychological detachment that allowed a single individual to operate undetected for years. Public awareness, forensic analysis, and courtroom testimony collectively revealed a predator who had redefined the operational and psychological boundaries of modern serial crime. The trial did not merely punish a criminal. It educated society on the terrifying efficiency and sophistication of a mind devoted to invisibility and control. Chapter 13: Modus Operandi and Signature. Understanding Keyes' method. Israel Keyes' crimes were distinguished not just by their randomness or geographic mobility, but by a highly developed modus operandi that reflected a combination of intelligence, meticulous planning, and psychological control. His approach to murder was operational rather than emotional, treating each abduction and killing as a controlled exercise in precision. Understanding Keyes' methods provides crucial insight into the unique challenges he posed to law enforcement and illustrates why he remained undetected for over a decade. Central to Keyes' modus operandi was preparation and forethought. Unlike impulsive offenders, Keyes carefully selected and observed victims, often over extended periods. He sought individuals who were accessible, minimally likely to resist, and sufficiently isolated to allow control. Potential victims were studied subtly, with attention to routines, behaviors, and vulnerabilities. Keyes approached these interactions in a calm, disarming manner, often initiating seemingly innocuous contact, a conversation, a request for help, or a casual approach to test compliance. The first step in his method was always managing perception. He needed to appear ordinary, trustworthy, or helpful to reduce suspicion. Another cornerstone of his method was the use of pre-buried kill kits. These caches, strategically located across the United States, contained weapons, restraints, and tools necessary to commit murder while minimizing exposure. By storing equipment in remote areas, sometimes months or years before a crime, Keyes eliminated the risk of transporting incriminating materials. The caches were meticulously organized, often with multiple contingencies, alternative weapons, different restraint types, and escape routes. This foresight allowed him to strike opportunistically, leveraging both time and space to maintain operational security. A Keyes' mobility was also a deliberate element of his strategy. He traveled extensively, committing murders far from home and across multiple states. This geographic randomness disrupted investigative patterns and hindered law enforcement from connecting cases. Unlike serial killers who operate within a familiar territory, Keyes exploited jurisdictional gaps, the limited communication between police agencies, and the inability of communities to link disappearances occurring thousands of miles apart. This mobility reinforced the invisibility central to his method, allowing him to operate undetected for years. Psychological manipulation was another defining feature of Keyes' modus operandi. He exhibited acute social intelligence, reading subtle cues in posture, speech, and behavior to gauge compliance or hesitation. Victims were carefully observed, and Keyes would exploit small signs of vulnerability to establish control. This manipulation often eliminated the need for violence during initial interactions. Compliance was secured through subtlety, charm, or calculated social engineering. In many ways, Keyes' psychological strategy was as crucial to his method as physical tools, enabling him to abduce without confrontation. Patience was another operational weapon. Keyes frequently waited months or even years before committing murder, meticulously observing and planning each act. This temporal detachment ensured optimal conditions, minimized risk, and allowed previous crimes to fade from public attention. Time functioned as a tool. Evidence would naturally decay, witnesses would forget details, and investigative focus would shift elsewhere. Keyes' patience was not mere virtue. It was an integral part of a method designed for invisibility, control, and sustained predation. While Keyes' crimes were operationally precise, they lacked what is traditionally called a signature in the sense of emotional or ritualistic behavior. He did not leave personal marks, trophies, or symbolic gestures. Instead, his signature was embedded in the methodical control and forethought applied consistently across crimes. The uniformity lay not in the outward actions, but in the underlying principles: premeditation, strategic planning, geographic randomness, psychological manipulation, and operational discipline. His signature was therefore intellectual rather than emotional, a calculated demonstration of mastery over both environment and victim. Keyes' approach to evidence management further exemplifies his methodical mindset. He minimized physical traces, avoided patterns that could link cases, and relied on environmental concealment. Remote abduction sites, careful disposal of victims, and the strategic use of preposition tools meant that forensic detection was minimized. This operational discipline, combined with geographic and temporal randomness, made him effectively invisible to investigators until the confluence of surveillance, circumstance, and human error led to his arrest. Understanding Keyes' modus operandi also requires recognizing his integration of psychology and logistics. Every action, approach, abduction, movement, and disposal was calculated to reduce exposure and maximize control. He merged operational strategy with psychological insight, predicting behavior, managing perception, and exploiting situational vulnerabilities. This integration of mental acuity and practical logistics set him apart from more impulsive or emotionally driven offenders, demonstrating a level of sophistication rarely observed in serial predation. That Keyes' method was adaptive as well. He learned from each crime, adjusted for unexpected variables, and refined his approach. This dynamic flexibility made him not only precise but resilient. Deviations from plan did not destabilize him, but were incorporated into subsequent strategies. His operational philosophy was iterative, continuously improving through experience while maintaining core principles of detachment, patience, and invisibility. Finally, Keyes' signature is inseparable from his psychological profile. The extreme compartmentalization, calm demeanor, and calculated patience that defined his personality were directly reflected in his criminal methodology. In every aspect, planning, execution, and concealment, he applied the same disciplined, detached reasoning that had allowed him to function undetected in society. Understanding this alignment between personality and method is essential for grasping why Keyes was not only successful but profoundly elusive as a modern nomadic killer. Continuing the examination of Israel Keyes' operational methodology, it becomes clear that his predatory precision extended beyond the immediate act of murder into long-term logistical and psychological strategies. Each crime was an exercise in invisibility, control, and premeditation, reflecting a level of sophistication that made him both dangerous and extraordinarily difficult to detect. Understanding the interplay between Keyes' modus operandi and his intellectualized signature is crucial for comprehending the unique nature of his predation. That a hallmark of Keyes' method was his ability to blend into society while planning extreme violence. To the outside world, he maintained a facade of normalcy, a father, husband, and small business owner. This duality allowed him to operate undetected for over a decade. Social interactions were carefully managed to avoid suspicion. He cultivated ordinary routines, engaged in local communities, and presented an unremarkable persona. This concealment of intent was a psychological shield, enabling him to move freely while keeping law enforcement and neighbors unaware of his predatory activities. That Keyes' approach to abductions combined psychological acuity with environmental mastery. He assessed locations for isolation, visibility, and escape potential, often choosing rural or transitional areas where intervention would be unlikely. Once a potential victim was identified, he employed subtle techniques, politeness, situational requests, or calculated social engagement to gain compliance. These methods minimized resistance and reduced the likelihood of leaving forensic evidence. By merging human psychology with environmental planning, Keyes achieved a level of control rarely observed in serial offenders. Pre-buried kill kits were another defining component of his operational sophistication. Keyes strategically placed these caches across multiple states, each containing weapons, restraints, and tools necessary to commit murder efficiently. The caches were organized with redundancies, multiple types of restraints, alternative weapons, and provisions for different scenarios. By relying on prepositioned equipment, he avoided transporting incriminating items during travel, thereby minimizing risk. This premeditation demonstrated foresight that extended beyond immediate criminal intent into logistical mastery over space and time. That a critical aspect of his modus operandi was temporal flexibility. He's often waited months or even years before committing a planned murder, observing victims and monitoring environmental conditions. Patience was both protective and operational. It allowed him to exploit natural decay of evidence, reduce witness recall, and avoid situational exposure. Temporal separation between crimes also reinforced the perception of randomness, which further complicated law enforcement efforts to identify patterns or connections between disappearances. That Keyes' crimes lacked overt emotional or ritualistic signatures, distinguishing him from serial killers driven by compulsion or fantasy. Instead, his signature lay in operational consistency and intellectual mastery. The same principles, preparation, control, mobility, and psychological manipulation, were applied across different contexts, locations, and victims. While outward actions varied to prevent detection, the underlying strategic approach remained constant. This intellectual signature made him predictable only in retrospect. Once investigators had access to his confessions and patterns of behavior, his adaptability was another critical element. He's adjusted tactics based on situational variables, including geographic differences, victim behavior, and environmental challenges. He learned from each encounter, refining both psychological manipulation and logistical execution. This iterative approach allowed him to evolve as a predator, improving operational efficiency while maintaining the core principles that defined his method. His ability to dynamically adapt to circumstances further complicated investigative efforts, as each crime could superficially appear disconnected from the last. Keyes' integration of psychology, logistics, and patience created a unique model of predation. Every action was part of a calculated framework designed to reduce risk and maximize control. The absence of emotional arousal in his decision-making reinforced his effectiveness, allowing him to maintain composure during both the planning and execution phases. He effectively treated murder as an applied problem in operational strategy, where each variable, victim, location, timing, tools, was considered and optimized. The psychological detachment underpinning his operational methodology also manifested in his ability to compartmentalize. He maintained relationships, employment, and community presence, all while orchestrating crimes across vast distances. This compartmentalization was not accidental. It was a deliberate mechanism that allowed him to live as a seemingly ordinary citizen while simultaneously committing acts of extreme violence. It reinforced both his invisibility and his efficiency as a nomadic killer. In conclusion, Israel Keyes' modus operandi and signature represent a convergence of intellect, patience, psychological manipulation, and operational foresight. His crimes were not impulsive but calculated, not expressive but strategic. Understanding this alignment between method and psychological profile is essential to comprehending why Keyes remained undetected for years and why his case remains a seminal study in modern criminal investigation. He was a predator whose signature was invisible in plain sight, a chilling testament to the effectiveness of intelligence applied to violence. Chapter 14: Psychological Profile. The mind of a nomadic killer. Understanding Israel Keyes requires a deep exploration of the psychological framework that underpinned his actions. Unlike many serial killers whose behaviors are impulsive or emotionally driven, Keyes exhibited a calculated, disciplined, and intellectualized approach to murder. His personality, cognitive processes, and behavioral strategies combined to create a uniquely dangerous predator whose nomadic tendencies, patience, and operational precision defied conventional profiling. Keyes' psychological profile offers insight not only into his crimes, but also into the mechanisms that allowed him to evade detection for over a decade. Central to Keyes' psychology was psychopathic detachment. He displayed a profound lack of empathy or remorse, viewing victims not as humans with lives and relationships, but as variables within a controlled system. This emotional distance allowed him to commit murders without hesitation, guilt, or emotional conflict. Unlike offenders whose compulsion is emotionally charged, Keyes approached killing as a logistical exercise. His satisfaction stemmed from successfully executing a plan and maintaining anonymity, rather than from sadistic pleasure or emotional gratification. Closely related to this detachment was his ability to compartmentalize. Keyes led a dual existence. On one hand, a seemingly ordinary citizen, husband, and father. On the other, a methodical predator capable of planning and executing murders across multiple states. This compartmentalization was not accidental. It was deliberate, enabling him to navigate social interactions without arousing suspicion. He could interact with neighbors, employers, and family members with the same calm, controlled demeanor that he applied when stalking or abducting victims. This cognitive separation between ordinary life and predatory activity is a hallmark of organized, high-functioning psychopathy. Intelligence and strategic thinking were key components of Keyes' psychological makeup. He displayed exceptional foresight, meticulous planning, and operational discipline. His crimes were not spontaneous acts, but carefully constructed operations, often involving pre-buried kill kits, extensive surveillance, and precise timing. Keyes' ability to think several steps ahead, considering contingencies, escape routes, and environmental variables, illustrates a mind that approached murder as an intellectual problem, optimizing control and minimizing risk. This intellectualization of violence is rare among serial killers and made him particularly elusive. Patience functioned as both an operational and psychological tool. Keyes demonstrated the ability to delay gratification, waiting months or even years before acting on planned murders. This temporal detachment served multiple purposes. It allowed evidence to decay, reduced the likelihood of detection, and reinforced his perception of invulnerability. Psychologically, patience was not merely a virtue but a manifestation of his ability to suppress impulsivity, an uncommon trait among violent offenders. His self-control and delayed action approach exemplify a predator who prioritized strategy over instinct. That Keyes' psychological profile also reveals an acute understanding of human behavior. He possessed high social intelligence, capable of reading subtle cues in posture, speech, and behavior to manipulate victims effectively. This skill allowed him to exploit trust, establish control, and secure compliance without resorting to overt violence during initial interactions. He demonstrated an ability to blend ordinary social behaviors with predatory intent, creating a facade of normalcy that disarmed potential victims. This mastery of psychological manipulation was a critical component of his operational success. Another defining element of Keyes' mind was his need for absolute control. Each crime was executed according to strict personal protocols, with contingencies planned in advance and environments carefully managed. Victims were controlled not only physically but psychologically, with Keyes determining the sequence, timing, and method of each act. Control, rather than emotional arousal or revenge, was the central motivation behind his predation. The psychological satisfaction derived from dominance, precision, and invisibility underscores the intellectualized nature of his serial offenses. Keyes' nomadic tendencies were psychologically significant as well. His frequent travel allowed him to detach from familiar environments, evade law enforcement, and select victims with minimal risk of recognition. This mobility also reflected an internalized strategy of unpredictability, reinforcing his perception of invulnerability. Psychologically, geographic randomness was both a defensive mechanism and a manifestation of his preference for control over the unknown. By moving continuously, Keyes minimized exposure while maintaining dominance over his operational environment. Furthermore, Keyes' psychological profile is characterized by low affective empathy, but high cognitive empathy. He could accurately perceive others' emotions, intentions, and vulnerabilities, yet remained emotionally detached from them. This combination allowed him to manipulate victims effectively without experiencing guilt or remorse. High cognitive empathy enabled the planning and execution of crimes with precision, while low affective empathy eliminated the emotional barriers that would prevent most individuals from committing such acts. Finally, Keyes' psychological resilience and composure were extraordinary. He maintained a calm demeanor under pressure, both during crimes and while in custody. This emotional stability reflects an advanced level of psychopathic organization, allowing him to function in daily life while simultaneously orchestrating complex criminal operations. It is this rare combination of intelligence, detachment, patience, and strategic insight that positions Keyes as a uniquely dangerous modern serial predator. Continuing the exploration of Israel Keyes' psychological profile, it becomes evident that his predatory behavior was the product of an exceptionally disciplined and strategic mind. The integration of psychopathy, intelligence, patience, and operational foresight created a predator who was both methodical and elusive. Understanding the interplay between these psychological traits is essential for grasping why Keyes was able to operate undetected for over a decade, leaving behind a trail of victims across multiple states. That a critical aspect of Keyes' mind was his exceptional self-control. Unlike impulsive offenders driven by rage, sexual compulsion, or emotional instability, Keyes exhibited remarkable restraint. He carefully planned each act, often waiting months or years before striking, ensuring that conditions were optimal and risk minimized. This delayed action approach required a high degree of emotional regulation, cognitive foresight, and disciplined execution. The ability to suppress immediate gratification in favor of long-term operational success is a distinguishing psychological feature that set him apart from more typical serial offenders. Keyes also demonstrated extraordinary situational awareness. He observed environments meticulously, considering visibility, escape routes, and potential witnesses. This heightened attention to detail extended to human behavior, where he could read subtle cues, predict reactions, and manipulate individuals without alerting them to danger. His understanding of human psychology was deeply instrumental in victim selection and control, allowing him to exploit trust, social norms, and vulnerability to his advantage. This combination of situational and social intelligence exemplifies a predator who merged cognition with operational precision. Another defining psychological trait was his need for absolute control over both victims and circumstances. Keyes' crimes were executed with exacting standards. He determined the timing, method, and sequence of events, often rehearsing scenarios mentally before acting. He removed unpredictability from situations wherever possible, relying on pre-buried kill kits, surveillance, and calculated interactions. This drive for control extended beyond the immediate act, influencing how he navigated society, maintained secrecy, and even presented himself to law enforcement once arrested. The meticulous control he exercised over his crimes mirrored his internal psychological need for order and dominance. That Keyes' nomadic tendencies were intertwined with his psychological framework. By frequently relocating and committing crimes far from familiar areas, he reduced the risk of recognition and maintained operational flexibility. Psychologically, this movement served multiple purposes. It allowed for strategic unpredictability, reduced exposure to investigative pressure, and reinforced his perception of invulnerability. His mobility was not merely a logistical convenience, but a psychological strategy that aligned with his preference for dominance, invisibility, and precision. The interplay of low affective empathy and high cognitive empathy is also crucial to understanding Keyes. While he lacked emotional attachment or compassion for his victims, he possessed a keen awareness of their thoughts, emotions, and potential reactions. This cognitive empathy enabled him to manipulate individuals effectively, ensuring compliance and reducing the risk of confrontation. Unlike emotionally driven offenders, Keyes' insight into human behavior was purely instrumental, applied to enhance operational success rather than to forge any connection. That Keyes' psychological detachment extended to his understanding of risk and consequence. He maintained a clear, rational assessment of law enforcement methods, public response, and potential obstacles, integrating these evaluations into his planning. He anticipated investigative trajectories, adjusted behaviors accordingly, and avoided patterns that might lead to detection. This rationalized detachment, combined with intelligence and patience, allowed him to operate under the radar for years, demonstrating a level of premeditated foresight rarely seen in serial predators. Another remarkable element was his ability to compartmentalize normal life and criminal activity. Keyes led a socially acceptable life, maintaining employment, family responsibilities, and community involvement. Simultaneously, he orchestrated complex murders across vast distances. This compartmentalization required significant cognitive control, enabling him to navigate daily interactions without arousing suspicion. It also reinforced his psychological resilience, as he could operate in parallel worlds without blending or destabilization. That Keyes' psychological profile reveals a rare convergence of traits: intellectualized violence, strategic patience, operational discipline, social intelligence, and extreme emotional detachment. He was not driven by compulsion or impulse. His crimes were the product of calculated reasoning, careful observation, and methodical execution. The psychological framework that enabled such behavior underscores both the danger he posed and the challenges investigators faced in understanding and apprehending him. Finally, Keyes' mind illustrates the modern evolution of serial predation. His crimes reflect a sophisticated integration of psychological manipulation, operational planning, and nomadic strategy, combining elements of traditional serial killing with a modern understanding of mobility, surveillance, and law enforcement limitations. By examining his psychological profile, experts gain critical insight into the mechanisms of modern serial predation, highlighting how intelligence, patience, and detachment can converge to create a uniquely dangerous and elusive criminal. Chapter 15: Legacy, Lessons, and the Impact of Israel Keyes. Understanding the modern nomadic killer, the arrest, confessions, and eventual demise of Israel Keyes left an indelible mark on law enforcement, forensic psychology, and the public understanding of serial predation. Unlike killers whose crimes are localized, impulsive, or emotionally driven, Keyes embodied a new paradigm: the modern nomadic killer. His operational sophistication, psychological detachment, and geographic mobility presented challenges that transcended traditional investigative models, forcing authorities to rethink approaches to crime detection, interjurisdictional coordination, and profiling. Keyes' legacy extends far beyond the horrors of his individual murders, offering critical lessons about criminal methodology, human psychology, and systemic vulnerabilities. That Keyes' impact on law enforcement practices is particularly significant. His crimes highlighted the limitations of traditional jurisdiction-based investigations. By committing murders across multiple states and leaving minimal forensic evidence, Keyes exposed the difficulty of linking seemingly isolated disappearances. Investigators were forced to enhance interagency communication, develop systems for cross-referencing cases geographically and temporally, and employ predictive behavioral analysis in ways previously underutilized. In many ways, Keyes' predation acted as a catalyst for modernization in investigative coordination, demonstrating the need for national collaboration when confronting highly mobile offenders. Another important aspect of Keyes' legacy lies in the understanding of operationalized psychopathy. Keyes exemplified a killer whose intelligence, strategic thinking, and psychological control were applied in a methodical, almost military-like fashion. His meticulous planning, use of pre-buried kill kits, and patient approach to victim selection challenged conventional assumptions about impulsivity in serial killers. Forensic psychologists and criminologists studying Keyes gained new insight into the intersection of intellect, detachment, and violence, recognizing the distinct profile of a high-functioning predator who operates with deliberate, unemotional efficiency. Keyes also forced a reconsideration of what constitutes a signature in criminal behavior. Traditional definitions emphasize emotional or ritualistic components, yet Keyes' signature was intellectual rather than symbolic. His consistent application of operational principles, patience, geographic randomness, psychological manipulation, and premeditated logistics formed a reproducible pattern that could only be recognized retrospectively, often after his confessions. This shift in understanding signature behavior has influenced both investigative profiling and academic perspectives on serial predation, emphasizing methodology over expressive behavior. Public and societal reaction to Keyes' crimes underscores the cultural impact of his actions. Communities realized that disappearances, once considered isolated or coincidental, could be part of a wider, coordinated pattern of predation. Parents, travelers, and local populations were confronted with the unsettling possibility that an intelligent, mobile, and emotionally detached predator could operate undetected in everyday environments. This societal awakening prompted heightened awareness of personal safety, community vigilance, and the importance of rapid reporting and information sharing. Keyes' crimes, while horrifying, contributed to broader discussions about public safety in an era of mobility and anonymity. Keyes' psychological detachment also contributed to debates in criminal psychology and law enforcement training. His lack of remorse, emotional detachment, and ability to compartmentalize normal life and extreme violence provided a case study in advanced psychopathy. Trainees and professionals in forensic psychology studied his cognitive patterns, social intelligence, and operational discipline to understand how highly functional predators maintain social camouflage while engaging in extreme acts. This research has informed modern strategies for early detection, risk assessment, and behavioral profiling of complex offenders. Additionally, Keyes' nomadic tendencies illustrate the challenges posed by modern mobility in criminal behavior. His use of transportation networks, interstate travel, and remote locations allowed him to evade law enforcement and commit crimes far from home. This mobility exposed systemic gaps in surveillance, jurisdictional coordination, and case linking, emphasizing the importance of comprehensive, integrated investigative approaches. In response, agencies have increasingly prioritized collaboration, cross-jurisdictional databases, and analytical tools capable of connecting geographically dispersed criminal activity. Keyes' legacy is not confined to law enforcement and psychological analysis. It also affects ethical and philosophical considerations about the nature of evil, human behavior, and societal vulnerability. He challenges conventional narratives about motive, emotion, and detectability, illustrating that intelligence, patience, and detachment can combine to create a uniquely efficient and dangerous predator. Keyes' crimes compel society to confront uncomfortable truths about the potential for human malevolence to exist quietly, methodically, and invisibly within ordinary environments. Finally, Keyes' impact is felt in academic and forensic communities, where his case has become a cornerstone study of modern serial predation. His operational methodology, psychological profile, and nomadic approach provide a comprehensive example of the intersection between intelligence, psychopathy, and criminal strategy. By analyzing Keyes' behavior, experts have developed improved models for predicting, preventing, and understanding the activities of similarly organized offenders. His case continues to shape discussions on the evolution of serial crime, the challenges of detection, and the psychological mechanisms that enable a single individual to operate undetected across multiple regions. The second part of Keyes' legacy examines the broader implications of his crimes on society, law enforcement, and our understanding of human behavior. Israel Keyes did not merely commit murders. He created a paradigm that has forced professionals and the public alike to reconsider the nature of predation in the modern age. His nomadic methodology, psychological sophistication, and meticulous operational strategies offer lessons that continue to influence investigative approaches, academic research, and public awareness. One of the most profound impacts of Keyes' crimes is the insight they provide into systemic vulnerabilities. By exploiting gaps in interjurisdictional communication, geographic separation, and investigative assumptions, Keyes revealed how traditional law enforcement structures can be bypassed by a highly mobile, intelligent predator. His ability to commit crimes across multiple states without detection demonstrates the necessity of national-level coordination, shared databases, and proactive communication between agencies. Since his arrest, there has been increased emphasis on integrating investigative data, tracking travel patterns, and using predictive behavioral analysis to anticipate the movements of potentially mobile offenders. Keyes also serves as a case study in criminal innovation. His pre-buried kill kits, patience, and operational flexibility exemplify a level of foresight rarely seen among serial killers. By combining premeditation with adaptability, he effectively created a framework for avoiding detection that challenges conventional profiling. His approach has informed forensic and criminal psychology fields, highlighting the importance of considering operational intelligence, logistical sophistication, and cognitive foresight when analyzing serial offenders. Professionals now study Keyes to understand how highly organized predators exploit both social and environmental factors to evade capture. Another significant aspect of his legacy is the examination of psychopathy in a functional context. Keyes' cognitive detachment, emotional compartmentalization, and high intelligence illustrate a form of psychopathy that is operational rather than impulsive. Unlike many offenders driven by emotional compulsion, Keyes' crimes were calculated, rational, and deeply strategic. His high cognitive empathy, ability to understand victims' behaviors without emotional connection, combined with low affective empathy, allowed him to manipulate, abduct, and kill without guilt or hesitation. These traits have become a focal point in studies of modern serial predation, influencing both assessment protocols and law enforcement training. Keyes' nomadic habits also forced society to confront the concept of randomness in predation. His victims were chosen opportunistically but strategically, and they often had no connection to him or each other. This randomness created widespread fear and uncertainty, illustrating how mobility and discretion can amplify a predator's impact on multiple communities. Public awareness campaigns, safety protocols, and media coverage have since emphasized vigilance in transient or vulnerable populations, reflecting lessons learned from the terror caused by Keyes' ability to operate unseen across vast regions. The educational impact of Keyes' case is equally important. Law enforcement agencies, forensic psychologists, and criminologists now utilize his example to train professionals in recognizing patterns of organized, mobile offenders. His integration of logistics, psychology, and environmental assessment provides a blueprint for understanding the capabilities of highly functional serial predators. Training programs have increasingly incorporated his methods to highlight operational planning, risk assessment, and the importance of interagency collaboration when dealing with nomadic criminals. Keyes' legacy also resonates philosophically and culturally. His crimes challenge assumptions about motive, emotion, and detectability, confronting society with the reality that extreme malevolence can exist in seemingly ordinary individuals. Unlike more emotionally driven killers, Keyes' intellect and operational focus allowed him to remain invisible while committing horrendous acts, forcing a reevaluation of what constitutes evil in practical, psychological, and social terms. His case underscores the importance of understanding behavior not only as a reflection of emotion, but also as a manifestation of strategic, detached cognition. Finally, Keyes' story continues to influence public understanding and policy. Media narratives, documentaries, and academic studies have highlighted the lessons from his crimes, emphasizing the importance of vigilance, forensic advancement, and understanding behavioral patterns that transcend traditional geographic limitations. His legacy is both cautionary and instructive. It serves as a stark reminder of the potential for a highly intelligent, disciplined, and mobile predator to exploit vulnerabilities, while simultaneously providing a framework for prevention, detection, and understanding of modern serial predation. In sum, Israel Keyes' impact is profound and multifaceted. He reshaped how law enforcement approaches mobile offenders, informed psychological profiling, and exposed societal vulnerabilities in ways that continue to resonate. His operational genius, nomadic strategies, and psychological sophistication provide a chilling yet instructive blueprint for understanding modern predation, highlighting the enduring relevance of his crimes to investigators, psychologists, and the public alike.